two Americans I was working under were Dr. Harold M. Agnew. He was the Federal Science Administrator of DARPA's Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time-space program at the time of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community. Now, the individual I was working under in Project Mars, when I was no longer a child, but I was actually in college at UCLA, was Howard Robart Hughes, one of our most prominent aviators. Agnew was the quintessential Manhattan Project physicist. He was part of everything. He literally took the Manhattan Project from the squash courts at the University of Chicago, where they did CP1, critical pile 1. He was one of the graduate students of Enrico Fermi controlling the graphite rods to prevent the critical pile from exploding, or possibly exploding. And he took it all the way to literally calibrating the magnitude of the Hiroshima blast from a chase plane that was following the Enola Gay. It was called the Great Artiste. And Agnew was part of every other essential element of the Manhattan Project. He even took the nuclear trigger from Los Alamos to the island of Tinian when it was put aboard the bomb that was dropped above Hiroshima. Now, I don't have to tell your audience who Howard Hughes was. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio has immortalized his life in that film, The Aviator. Howard Hughes did not die in 1976. That was a cover story. My research indicates that cover story was put in place because Hughes was working on sensitive defense technical projects related to the CIA, including the Glomar Explorer, which was a submersible that was going to be plucking a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific. He was also working on the technology that we were using to get to Mars, which was the Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, or Jumproom, or Space Elevator. Those were its vernacular terms. But it was technically known as an Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, or ARC. That's why, for example, when Laura Eisenhower was told in 2006 and 2007 that the government wanted she and her two twin boys, Gavin and Garrick Eisenhower, to settle on Mars, Laura was told that she was going to be going via ARC. That wasn't ARK, like the Ark of Noah, which she initially thought it was a device, to save life on Earth. It was ARC, Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber. So when I was writing my books, I thought, this is a bit absurd or ludicrous that with some people my information has received the response it did, because these were two of the most prominent technologists of the 20th century. If you had, I think something like 11% of the American population of 140 million, or 16 million Americans served in World War II, and one of them was given the sensitive assignment of taking that nuclear trigger to the island of Tinian to be installed on the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima, and that was Harold M. Agnew. He was the director of the W Division, the weapons division at the labs, as we used to call them, the Los Alamos National Labs, from 1967 to 70. And then he became the director of our biggest nuclear lab, the Los Alamos National Labs, between 1970 and 78. So if you were going to be forging starting a time travel program, wouldn't you put such a trustworthy public servant in charge of it? Of course. And a lot of the other claimants who've been coming forward, they can't offer any information about who was running it or who they were serving with. And I've offered all of that for years. I've even offered photographic evidence that when I was fading from view from Gettysburg, and the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg was taken, I had described for years in lectures how I was fading from view when the photograph was taken. I actually looked over to the left and saw the man setting up his camera, and then I looked to the right. And that photograph was analyzed by William B. Stillings and John Gannon. And you can see my cheekbone and my eye socket in that Civil War photograph. Okay, so that is not a known Civil War photograph photographic defect. There was blurring of people when they moved because of the slow exposure of the film, but there was no seeing through somebody's body to their bones. And that's what that photograph did, because I was fading from view. So there's multiple proofs like that. Maybe we can talk about some of them today, but
yes,
I have proved my claims every which way from Sunday, not because I wasn't, clearly I was in two esoteric programs because they were keeping the number of participants rather small. But these were prominent programs. These were leading technologists.
Mm-hmm.
I've named dozens of people who were involved in Pegasus. I brought forward 4 other individuals that I went to Mars with. Not just that I mentioned that I was trained with, but I brought forward 4 who went and were on the surface with me. So imagine, Armstrong and Aldrin walking on the moon on July 20th of 1969, and the government denying it happened, other people claiming they did it, and so forth. That's really a valid analogy of what I've experienced. I am somebody who served in a legitimate, real, leading government defense technical program that expanded from time travel into getting to Mars in a very quick way. It was only taking us about 20 minutes. And, my analogy here is it would be like Armstrong and Aldrin walking on the moon and then having the government deny it and the other people making false claims that, no, they had walked on the moon. That's kind of where we are with this information. And it's really, when you get right down to it, it's amazing. It's amazing that a country as great as ours lied to its people about these advances, so that I'm talking about, as I said, I'm almost 60. I'm talking about things that began in my life when I was 6 years old. I first teleported between the old Curtiss Wright building in Woodridge, New Jersey, and the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds that they were using sort of as a collection area for those jumping in from different parts of the country to New Mexico, to do things like interact with Harold Agnew at the Los Alamos National Labs in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I did that when I was 6, and my dad and I met with Dr. Agnew, and he said to my dad, "How was your trip?" My dad said, "Fine and fast." And then Harold looked up from his desk and said, "Oh, did you take the teleporter?" And my dad said, "Yes, and so did my number 3 son, Andrew." And he looked over at me and said, "How old?" And my dad and I both answered him, 6. So that allows us to date the advent of viable, practical, reduced to practice teleportation in the U.S. defense technical community. So all I'm doing is sharing the truth about 2 great accomplishments by our great country. I felt I had to bring this information forward because, in particular, I had been a career environmentalist. I earned 4 advanced degrees in environmental affairs and 2 law degrees and 2 master's degrees, one from Cambridge, and in the British environmental discipline, which is land economy. And I really felt that, look, we can't just talk about climate change. We have to come up with solutions. And I realized that the transport sector is one of the big causes of greenhouse gases. Now, it's disputed whether it's 20, 40, 60%, but it is a big deal. If we could eliminate greenhouse gases coming from the transport sector of society, we can do a lot to literally stem climate change. And, this summer we saw the effects of that in the West, where the West was burning down, basically. So it's a serious issue. I know there are people who deny the idea that we're looking at climate change. We're getting global cooling in places as well as global warming. We seem to be heating up in the whole solar system. So it may not be our environmental practices. It may just simply where we're going through in space,
right,
where our solar system is going through in space. But the bottom line is we're going to have to do stuff about it. And so I came forward about 15, 20 years ago as an environmentalist so that everybody could Tesla teleport. We could have been going from, let's say, London, England to Sydney, Australia, which by commercial passenger plane still takes 24 hours. We could have been doing that in seconds, beginning in 1970. And so that's why I came forward. I came forward because the information that I knew was critical to our planetary survival. So that's basically the story. It was a real program. I haven't been making this up. I had already arrived professionally before I started talking about it. I had worked with Norman Cousins at UCLA, where I was his protege. I had worked for Captain Jacques Cousteau when I was a young writer. I had earned my law degree at Lewis and Clark Law School, which is the oldest and the biggest environmental law program of any law school in the country. I had gone on to be admitted to the Washington State Bar Association and the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington. And I simply did not have to come forward with this information. I was already professionally successful. But I decided actually to risk my life because I believe the information was that important, and it is. We need to start teleporting.
Yeah. The Jetsons, was like, when I grew up, that was like the promise of the future. That was the future. And if things weren't kept secret from us, that's what we would be living, the Star Trek lifestyle. Even for shipping, I mean, think about the impact that teleportation, just for shipping. My goodness, your cost for shipping items would be nil. I mean, very little compared to what it costs.
Absolutely. The number of individuals who were killed and wounded during the 13 years of the Vietnam War are exactly the number of Americans that we lose or that are severely injured every year from automobile transport. Now, we saw the colleges of this country virtually shut down by the young people who didn't want to serve in the war and were protesting the existence of the Vietnam War. But we have nobody out there protesting automobiles. And we lose as many as we lost in the 13 years of that war every year in America.
Right.
So we have to find another way to get from point A to point B. And that is teleportation. When I was in Project Pegasus, I was going backward in time. I went back as far as 100 million BC to the time of the vegetarian dinosaurs through a device called a chronovisor. That was basically a form of holographic time travel. If we stayed in for more than 15 minutes, however, a density effect occurred and we were actually there and we had to be extracted with a portal.
Oh, no, repeat that again. I'd never heard that before.
Well, I was going to say, let me tell the other shoe drop, which is I was also going physically forward in time to the year 2045, which was selected for us to go forward to because it was 100 years after the end of World War II, the beginning of the atomic age. So that was basically the ambit of my travels. I was going back holographically and physio-holographically through the third and fourth dimensional chronovisor. That was basically a way to set up a hologram so that if that hologram was formed around us, we went to that place. That's, for example, I was sent back to consult with General George Washington in August of 1776 at his encampment in Brooklyn Heights. And I was commissioned by DARPA under the Nixon administration to brief Washington to have him retreat his troops from New York Harbor. Now, even in David McCulloch's book, 1776, published in 2005, your listeners can find his reference to, it's still not known why Washington suddenly at dusk one night decided to retreat all his troops from New York Harbor. The reason is that I and another child in Pegasus were sent back in time to tell General Washington to do that, because when they were examining his life via chronovisor, they found us doing it. So they trained us and had us go and do it in real time. So I was actually trained in what to say to Washington. And that solves that age-old mystery. In fact, Washington thought we were angels, and there's a famous Currier and Ives drawing of me outside Washington's tent. Nobody has ever explained that. Is there a picture of this Washington kind of sitting back in his dive-in in his tent with this young boy standing outside his tent? That was me. I was sent there, and I'm not making that up. We were really visiting George Washington, and he was an immaculate individual. I was very impressed by Washington. He was a very commanding figure.
that is one of my favorite stories that you tell. And I believe you also said that in the tent were like couches and rugs, and it was pretty lavish.
Yeah, there was a horn for ammunition hanging from one of the hosts. There was a Persian rug. There were several plush sofas. So, he was a very prominent Virginian. He had married the richest widow in Virginia, Martha Dandridge Parke Custis, Martha Washington. And he inherited something like, I think it was 400 acres of the richest farmland in Virginia and 200 slaves that he ultimately manumitted. He actually released them and let those individuals go free, as we all deserve to be. And I think that is a measure of the greatness of Washington. Jefferson and the rest of them didn't do that. They didn't free their slaves. And this, of course, was long before the Civil War, a number of generations before the Civil War.
Wow.
But Washington was as charismatic as a person can be. I really can't describe how impressed I was by Washington. He had physical rectitude. He had perfect posture. He was brave and commanding just in the way he stood and acted. But he did have kind of a cavalier kind of personality. Of course, his father was of the cavalier generation. So, like when we were sitting there with him, he kind of cupped his hand and tilted his head back and said to Alexander Hamilton, "Say, Alec, these boys say that they are time travelers from our future. Tell me, have you ever heard such a thing?" And Alexander Hamilton was walking through his tent and said, "No, General, I never have." And he kept on asking us, "What do you mean by time travelers?" And I said, "General Washington, we are from your future, and the government of the country that you're going to play a key role in founding, the United States of America, has developed a way to move people around in time. So we're now coming almost 200 years back to your time. We're not from this time." Now, he ended up telling that story for the rest of his life, that he had had angelic intervention during the Revolution. Now, he may have. I don't know what else he experienced in his life. I was only there for a short period of time in his presence. But I believe that's what he was talking about. And that solves a mystery that American historians are probably still talking about to this day in college classrooms. Has one of them called me? Well, wait a minute. Henry Graff, the emeritus professor of history at Columbia, who was investigating why Barack Obama spent such little time at Columbia, just as George Stephanopoulos and Wayne Allen Root, two of his classmates, were doing. I sent him a lengthy email explaining exactly what Barack Obama was doing during his college years, which is what I was doing, and how I had been instructed to transfer from UCLA to Columbia, the very school he transferred to, the very same semester, which was fall of 1981. We were going to Mars. I said Barack was a participant in the secret space program. Why he has chosen to lie about that and deny that as president is beyond me. He's got his own reasons. I have some theories, but I don't know why ultimately he has decided to do so. But we went to Mars. We were trained with him. We went to Mars with him. His then name was Barry Soetoro. And I wrote literally this distinguished emeritus professor at Columbia, and I couldn't even get him to call me. I sent him my phone number. So the analogy there would be, imagine if Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were going to leading American historians or historians of the space program, saying, "Look, we landed on the moon. Okay, we walked on the moon with Apollo 11." And they would not even be answered by the historians investigating what they were doing. That's where we're at. That's why I've done so many TV and radio interviews. Mm-hmm. We are falling totally behind our national understanding of what we as a common people have achieved. And that's not America. That's not my America. I even wrote Presidents Obama and Trump right before the DNC and the RNC this year. And do you know that Barack Obama didn't answer me, even though he was one of my colleagues, and President Trump and his son Eric, actually Eric Trump and then Donald Trump, on Wednesday and Thursday of the RNC said, just in complete non sequitur, this was right after my July 28th letter to President Trump, "We finally have to go to Mars." was just a complete non sequitur that they dropped into their speeches, not even explaining what we would do there. Okay, that followed my letter to President Trump by weeks. I don't know if my letter was ever passed on to him. I sent both of those letters to the addresses that are provided to right Presidents Obama and Trump. So what I'm saying is, the last two American presidents have lied to the American people. When Eric Trump and Donald J. Trump, the president, were stating that we have to go to Mars, that is not true. We have been going to Mars since 1964. I went the first time on July 7th of 1981. Aaron, next year, that'll be 40 years.
Wow.
So, I've been attacking these 50-year cover-up of time travel and the 40-year cover-up of Mars visitation, because these are some of the greatest accomplishments of our great country.
Yeah,
and we can't lie about what we've done.
Exactly. And look how much we advanced after the moon program. I mean, they had LCD screens, pretty soon you had calculators, whole new technologies were developed. Just imagine what we would have if these programs were public and we could be benefiting from all of the benefits of all of these other technological breakthroughs. I mean, we wouldn't be living in scarcity, that's for sure.
Well, and also look at the technologies we could introduce. I have never taken the position that we should declassify and deploy all of the time travel technologies, because I've often said that involving mass people on mass timelines would lead to mass confusion.
Yeah.
But there are some things we can introduce. We can introduce Tesla teleportation. Aaron, are you there?
Yes. Tesla teleportation.
I have something on my phone. We can introduce Tesla teleportation so that we will solve the distance problem. And in the 2045 I visited, we were not only Tesla teleporting around, but I went to an intelligence facility somewhere in the American Southwest. And I went into an elevator-like device, and I stepped out not just in another elevator, but in another building, in another city. They were showing me that teleportation had become so advanced that, let's say you're at home in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. You could go down the street to like a bus stop and teleport to work in downtown Los Angeles. Okay. So they were showing me that it was so advanced by 2045 that we could literally, you want to go to Paris, you're in Los Angeles, you want to go to Paris, go to this place, and then step out of that elevator-like device, and there you are. So that's how advanced teleportation is going to become. Now, to the degree that too much of my true information has been met with incredulity, maybe we'll be retarded and delayed in reaching that stage of technical development, but we ultimately will.
Yes.
And so Tesla teleportation we can introduce. There were medical effects. The children involved developed in adulthood a disease that mimicked diabetes. The adults who were involved had heart valve defects. My father's own mitral valve was damaged. He had to have it replaced with a St. Jude's cup. Bless the memory of Danny Thomas and St. Jude's in St. Louis for that device. And he survived 13 years with, his little robotic mitral valve clicking away in his chest. So my own father's heart valve was damaged by the Tesla teleportation. But at the same time, I should add that they were giving me medications to lessen the impact of the teleportation. And I would dare say that by now, they probably know how to control for any medical side effects. I do believe it's possible. They've been moving members of the executive branch around via teleportation. That would explain when we see a president or a vice president or a secretary of state get off in Europe and they're not even jet lagged. I mean, I remember noticing that even when Hillary Clinton was first lady. So I think for a number of years, they've been using Tesla teleportation inside the government. And there's that sort of clubby thing that obtained in the Manhattan Project. The Los Alamos physicists sort of had that sense of exclusivity. I think that kind of spread to, and also, of course, the weaponization of time travel sequestered Tesla teleportation inside the executive branch. But I think it has been used to shuttle our executive branch officials around the world in a time-urgent way. I suspect that what they've been doing is actually going to Tesla teleporters at air bases and then arriving at U.S. air bases or Army bases around the world, and then, being placed on a plane to show them getting off a plane. But I don't know of any medication or anything else that cures jet lag, and I've experienced it, man. Wow. And I would just urge your listeners to think about how many times we've seen a Bill Clinton, a Hillary Clinton, a Barack Obama, a Joseph Biden, or whoever, show no weariness after getting off of a long plane flight. So I think that to the degree we've been using inside the executive branch, and of course there's that story about the one at Carswell Air Force Base decanting people to Pine Gap in Australia. Mm-hmm. So I think to that extent, everybody should be able to get around the world so quickly. It'll bring the world together. We'll recognize that we are one race, one species, and we have to get beyond ethnicity and nationalism and religion and all these other things that are blocking us from realizing we are all related. We are all 87% the same genes, regardless of gender. So I believe that teleportation will bring us together as a species so that we can recognize that we are only one race, the human race. Now, another device that could be deployed, at least on a limited access basis, would be the Montauk Chair. The Montauk Chair was a quantum access device that delivers you to subjective moments in your own future. Now, imagine somebody is in psychotherapy for the loss of a child, the father or the mother, and they feel like the whole world is over because they've lost their baby, and that's quite natural. There's a bond between parent and child that is unlike any other. And I'm sure there are biological substrates, certainly spiritual substrates for that reality. Well, if people who are in, let's say, a unipolar depression from the loss of a child could take the Montauk Chair to 5 years in the future and see them bouncing their new baby on their knee, that would help get them out of their depression. So that's another device that I would like to see introduced, at least on a limited access basis, would be the Montauk Chair. The chronovisors could probably be worked into museums and libraries where school kids could see the signing of the U.S. Constitution just as I saw it at a watch post, a national security watch post in Flemington, New Jersey. I literally saw the signers of the U.S. Constitution as they looked. Wow. In life. And in fact, the only one who was, besides, I could see Washington, but I couldn't really make him out in that. But Benjamin Franklin was so taller and so heavier, and had such a bigger head than every man in that room. He was truly amazing. He was, you could see that it was Benjamin Franklin. He was sitting on a divan at the front of the group of men sitting there. But we originally said to the guy when he said, "Boys, what do you think? What are we looking at?" And we said the signing of a public television reenactment of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. And he said, "Nope. Who's this right here?" And he pointed to Washington. And of course, George Washington, not Hancock, was presiding over the signing of the Constitution as distinguished from the Declaration of Independence. And then he said, "Well, and you can see who's here. That's obviously Benjamin Franklin." And then as we were leaving, he said to us, "Boys, that's not a reenactment. That is the signing of the U.S. Constitution." So I would like to see a kind of a limited access use of chronovision so that we could create museums and libraries so that every subsequent generation will actually look into the past and see what it actually involved.
Yes, I think that would be fantastic, and it would make history class the most popular class, and I've often thought that too, that very same thing. You might have said that in another interview, but yeah, that's the learning aspect of seeing something. And also in the courts, I mean, you could give the bank robber one more chance to recant his not guilty plea and say, hey, we're going to look at the chronovisor,
I hate to mention it, but look at the O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah.
Because his shoe prints with those Bruno Magli shoes were there does not mean he was the murderer. He could have gone by and tracked his feet through the blood that was there.
Yeah.
But imagine if we could have gone back to that scene and see who killed Ron and Nicole.
Oh, it'd be horrible to see.
Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson. That's what we're missing out on.
Yeah.
And by the way, to the extent that I believe chronovision is being used inside the U.S. intelligence community, everybody connected to any intelligence agency that I had known from my work in Pegasus or Mars over the years, and there were quite a few in LA, maybe about 10, all of them knew that Simpson was innocent. I hate to say that to people because there's really a committed belief that O.J. Simpson got away with murder when he was acquitted.
Yeah.
In the killing of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. And Ron Goldman's father, Fred, I believe it was, ultimately sued him. And you may recall he was represented by Daniel Petruccelli and was found liable. Everybody in LA working for the intel community knew that he was not guilty. The timeline didn't fit it. So yeah, if we had chronovision being openly deployed by law enforcement, maybe there could be a special bureau under, let's say, the FBI that would be dispatched to localities when there is a heinous crime like that, and we could literally go back to that moment and photograph the assailant, the guilty party.
That'd be cool.
So there's an example, because people end up believing. It's kind of frightening, actually, and as an attorney, I've witnessed this. There's a certain point in certain cases where the majority of people in a society believe that somebody is guilty when they are not. And I fought for years to get an innocent man out of prison. And it's just a really sort of atavistic aspect of society, of all societies. They have to find somebody guilty for something if there's been a heinous crime. And we would pretty much obviate that problem, that propensity to send innocent individuals to jail, to prison, by using chronovision in an intelligent way openly. It doesn't mean that we have to introduce chronovision for everybody to use, because after all, we would all like to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, but I think few of us would want to see him making love to Mrs. Lincoln or on the John, relieving himself. We don't want to introduce chronovision broadly because it will violate privacy.
Right.
And privacy is a paramount human virtue. So there are complications to declassifying and deploying time travel devices. I've spoken about them at length to not only be a harbinger of the release of the information, but a harbinger of the containment of the technology so that we all don't lose our privacy or our freedom when anybody can go back and see anything we've done. Most people will admit, certainly also in the development of their sex life as adolescents and as young adults, that everybody does things that they don't want to brag about. It's very common. And it's the rare person who's actually sexually blocked who doesn't, for example, sexually experiment in adolescence. And that's very common. That's part of the human experience. So there are things like that, and private information of just a private nature. Different discussions we have with others, different things that we do to maintain ourselves that we just don't want photographed.
Right.
And so privacy is a paramount human virtue. Human beings are naturally kind of shy when most of us like to make love with one person, not share it with the world. So we don't want to release chronovision. And in fact, I do believe that Homeland Security would probably show up if somebody independently developed chronovision, which is possible. In fact, I've released the way for people to develop that, which is I've described how I asked my dad, how are they making these holograms by which you're you're capturing images from the past, and if those images are brought down around us on the stage, we end up going to that place. And that was after my dad had sent me 8 times in summer of '71 to Ford's Theater to try to see who shot President Lincoln.
Wow.
And I was describing how to audiences mostly on radio, but also in my public lectures, how that was happening. And, how I asked my dad, how are you doing this? And I was describing how he said, we're putting an electromagnetic signal through an eight-sided bismuth crystal. And then a researcher into my experiences, a Briton by the name of Wynne Keach, made a brilliant discovery of a patent that was granted the prominent IBM physicist Leo Esaki in 1967 that listed my dad's work on bismuth crystals, which he shared with Neil Williams of the Thomas A. Edison Research Lab in West Orange, New Jersey, from 1962, involving bismuth crystals, and Esaki's patent involved 8-sided bismuth crystals. So that was another basically proof of what I had been saying. I couldn't have planted a patent for somebody else, much less my own father, or for both of them, in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office files. I just couldn't have done that. Well, the one for my father was granted in '62, and then of course Esaki in '67, when I was only 5 going on age 6 by September of '67. I just could not have done that.
Right.
So that was one of the proofs that established that I've been telling the truth all along. Yeah. And so I've been releasing that information about the chronovisor for years. So I'm amazed that somebody hasn't just been tinkering with bismuth crystals until a hologram pops out. Because all you've got to do is send EM signals through an 8-sided bismuth crystal until that happens, and then you've rediscovered chronovision.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be some people in our audience that's going to be tinkering with bismuth crystals. I know you can heat them up in a pan, and they form into like perfect geometric shapes, square shapes, rectangle shapes.
Yeah, there's something about the rectilinear crystallization of bismuth that relates to this, and I'm just not a physicist. I've never stated that I was one of the time travel technologists in the program. I was a time traveler. I was a chrononaut. And by the way, that's not my term. That's a term that I took from a fictional work from the early 1960s. I've just popularized it because that's what we were doing. We were time traveling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I can't understand why anyone would doubt your story with all the witnesses that have come forward. I mean, Bernie Mendez, he's a very interesting witness, a very interesting character in history. Brett Stillings, and all the other people.
William Whitecrow,
late
right? William Whitecrow, and of course Ken Johnston Sr. Now let me just mention Ken. Now I know all 4 of those gentlemen. Of course, we miss Whitecrow. He's a great man. He died in 2018. But I know all of those guys from Mars, the 4 of them. I knew Whitecrow going back to the 4th grade because he was my martial arts instructor on Pegasus in the late 60s, early 70s. I know William Stillings and Bernard Mendez from the time we were trained in summer of '80 at College of the Siskiyous, trained for Mars. But I only met Ken Johnston Sr., Ralph Kennedy Johnston Sr., on Mars. He saved me in the device that was known as a hopper or a sky taxi. It was like a lenticular craft sort of stretched over a helicopter, and it would go sort of almost straight up and then straight across and then straight down. And he was being deployed to rescue us. Like if we got in trouble with predators, we would call him in. We had a device to call in to one of the jump room facilities, and Ken would show up.
Okay.
One time he saved Whitecrow and I from these pretty nasty looking predators. And I had witnessed 2 of my colleagues being eaten by the tall reptoid predators, and I did not want to have such a fate.
Oh,
so I was always grateful to Ken for rescuing us in that device. Yeah. He called it the hopper, by the way. Now, Ken has a personal document from NASA personally signed to him, in many cases containing salutations from 58 named astronauts. Now, that document alone should end any discussion about whether I and my colleagues who were giving interviews together about going to Mars together, namely Basiago, Stillings, Mendez, Whitecrow, and Johnston, were telling the truth or not. How many people do you know could collect 58 autographs from name astronauts? I mean, name somebody, I'll tell you whether they're in there. In fact, I think the only signature that's not in there is John Glenn, but he's got signatures from, the Mercury 7 through the Skylab and the Space Shuttle. Wow. Even a personal salutation from Ellison Onizuka, one of the brave Americans who died on Space Shuttle Challenger, and Sally Ride and the rest of them. Now, like I said, some of those signatures in that book are to Ken personally. Ken was one of the NASA officials who had been working with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts, and for that matter, later the Skylab and Space Shuttle astronauts, who went to Mars. You can't fake that. We're willing to submit that to a handwriting expert to say, yes, that's Neil Armstrong. Yes, that's Jim McDivitt. Yes, that's Al Worden. Okay, these are American astronauts, famous and not so famous, but they're all name American astronauts because they're part of the overt space program, NASA. We were under another agency and another program, and it wasn't even under NASA officials. It was under Howard Hughes. But nonetheless, because of his past work with the entire NASA program since the early 60s, Ken has signatures for 58 American astronauts. So we've got evidence. Mm-hmm. I would like to see anybody who could say, well, he was probably just going around to meet astronauts and get their autograph at conferences. Well, that would have been possible by somebody, but not personal thank yous from the astronauts. Right. Ken, it was great working with you on Project Mercury. Thanks for all your great work on Project Apollo, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So, and those are in the handwriting of those named astronauts. So it kind of makes me feel good about America when I think about that, and that is that the autographs and the thanks that the astronauts who were known to the American people gave one great man, and that's Ralph Kennedy Johnston Sr., Ken Johnston, will ultimately prove the fact that we were on Mars. And that's what the American people deserve to know. When NARA was passed in 1958, the leading mission that the U.S. Congress, as the guardian of the interests and the will of the American people, gave NARA, as it was originally known, not NASA, but it later became NASA, was the expansion of human knowledge of space and the near-Earth environment. That means that when NASA was created, there never should have been any secret space program. That is unconstitutional to the extent that it violates the express will, the express mission that was given in the enabling legislation for the space agency by the U.S. Congress as the first among equals of branches of the American government. We're supposed to have a constitutional government based on the Congress, the executive, and then the Supreme Court. That's why, for example, the Speaker of the House is third in line of succession after the President and Vice President, even before the Secretaries of State and Defense, okay? Because we're supposed to be governed by ourselves, by the Congress as the representative of the people. Now, clearly the President plays what had been the Prime Minister's role in Britain, still is. And he's our chief ambassador, he's our executive, he's our chief executive. So the President does have a special role. But Congress is supposed to be the first among equals. And the Congress told NASA that its number one mission was the expansion of human knowledge of space and the near-Earth environment. Well, I know we've gone to Mars. Do I believe Ben Rich, of course, the former CEO of Lockheed, that we now have the technology to take ET home, implying that we're even outside the solar system, that the Project Serpo case probably happened? Yes, I don't see why Ben Rich would have said that if it wasn't true. Specifically, he said, if there's anything you think we've accomplished, we already have. We now have the technology to take E.T. home. Well, where was E.T.? He wasn't from our solar system in that great movie by Steven Spielberg. He was from outside our solar system, outside our galaxy even. Mm-hmm. So certainly outside our star system, our solar system. So I know we've been to Mars because I've been there. I went there about 40 times.
Wow. I
am now legally blind, and we don't know what advanced, new dangerous and experimental technologies I was exposed to in Project Pegasus for 4 years, and then almost 4 years in Project Mars that may have permanently damaged my vision. I can see, but I can no longer read and write because of visual impairment. I'm not going to live the rest of my long life being quiet about what we did.
No.
Now, there's a propensity for experiencers to do that because certainly by the time Project Mars came along, they were able to block our memories. Most of us did not remember our experiences for almost 25 years. My last trip to Mars was in May of 1984, a year before I took my BA in history from UCLA. I was 22 years old. I had been going up since I was 19, a good 20 years younger than Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins when they landed on the moon, or did the lunar landing, I should say. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to live the rest of my life lying about what I did what I first did when I was 19 years old, and that was go to Mars. In fact, I quoted Alan Bartlett Shepard, the Mercury astronaut, when I was in the jump room facility. The Courtney Hunt of the CIA was not sending me, and I was getting frustrated. And I said, Courtney, light this candle, which was a joke based on quoting Alan Shepard. But Alan Shepard in 1960, when everybody knows that when he was getting, eager to be sent into space, said from the Mercury capsule to mission control, light this candle. Well, that's what I said 20 years later when I was standing in an elevator-like device at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California. And Courtney Maurice Hunt of the CIA, a longtime CIA employee, on behalf of Howard Hughes down the hallway on the 4th floor, was not sending me from the 8th story of that building to a U.S. facility on the red planet. So that's just a measure of how advanced the U.S. government was actually getting during these years. This was 40 years ago.
Wow.
Now, 40 years later, would they have left the solar system so that 15 or 20 years Ben Rich could have said that? 15 or 20 years ago, he could have said that? I think yes. And, I think it was a good thing for President Trump to start the space agency. I think we always needed one. Mm-hmm. So I sent him my letter asking him to declassify Project Mars because we now have a space agency and it's time for the world to be told the truth about our activities in space. And that's all I've been doing. I haven't been embellishing anything. In my lectures, TV and radio shows, and now in my books, I just tell what happened. Nothing is embellished. Nothing is made up. It's just what happened. Just like people wrote books about being in the space program or landing at Normandy June 6th of 1944. I've just been describing what happened. And I feel it was my obligation. I've now written the 6 books that I feel I was born to write. I have 18 more or 19 more planned, but I've written 6 books now. My trilogy covers my paranormal experiences that had nothing to do with time travel or Mars visitation. My 2 memoirs cover time travel and Mars. And then I'm writing about past lives that I've remembered since I was a small child. And I've proven some of those past lives. By the way, I've seldom talked about it in my discussions of Project Pegasus on radio or television, and that is, when we were placed in Project Pegasus, which was in fall of 1969, that was officially, I had already teleported to New Mexico with my father in winter of 1968. But in fall of 69, I was age 7 going on age 8, and they wanted us to know that since since we were going to be time traveling for the U.S. government, if we were afraid of dying while time traveling, they wanted us to know basically that we have a soul, we are a soul, that we have numerous past and future lives, and that we shouldn't worry about being killed on the project because the U.S. government had proven the doctrine of the transmigration of the soul, reincarnation. We call it reincarnation, of course, but it should be incarnation unless we come back as the same person. And there's evidence that Anthony Peake offers in his brilliant work, The Labyrinth of Time, that indicates that happens as well as reincarnation.
Wow.
I've spoken with people because of the sort of capacious nature of my work. I get a lot of phone calls from people who've had paranormal experiences. And I've spoken with a number of people who know that they're on the second or third time around as the same person. Okay. But what I wanted to say about what happened on Pegasus was she said, we're going to regress you to one past life. I'm an expert at this. I've been trained by the government how to do it expertly. I'm going to get you very relaxed. I'm going to literally take you back to a past life. Now, we want you to just go to one of your past lives because we don't want you to focus on your past lives. What's going to happen to you in Project Pegasus is going to be exciting for multiple lifetimes. So don't worry about that. We're going to be sending you kids to the past and future, and a lot of it, and you're going to see things that you would scarcely believe you'd ever be looking at. So we don't want you to focus on your past lives, but we do want you to go back to one. And they regressed me to a life where I saw myself being hired as one of the first hires for Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts. Well, Amherst was founded in 1821. And she said, what time is it? And I said, 1821. Now, I had done no reading. I'd seen no documentary about Amherst. I was age 7 going in age 8. And I described how this man who was about 20 years older, when I was 20 in 1821 or around there, in my early 20s certainly, had said, you were always good. I didn't know what my name was in that life, but he said, you were always good at geometry. And in school, I want you to be my geometry professor of the college that I'm starting. And I'm saying in this past life regression, as I'm laying on a desk, a large art table, and the other kids are around me, and this expert in past life regression from the Department of Defense has told us, that we can't die. Our soul cannot die. Our bodies can be killed, but not our souls. Mm-hmm. And they described how we would go back to heaven, and just the whole thing that the past life, the near-death experience has shown all of us. And she said, Andy, what was the name of this gentleman who hired you at Amherst right after its founding, or upon its founding, essentially? And I blurted out, as a kid from New Jersey, born on September 18th, 1961, and there's no way I heard this name anywhere in New Jersey in the 1960s. And that was Zephaniah. Now, when I investigated my experiences, I found that the founder of Amherst was a gentleman named Zephaniah Swift Moore. And he had moved from Dartmouth College and founded Amherst with a couple of students and teachers that he kind of pulled away from Amherst in New Hampshire, I guess it is. And that's what the man was doing in my past life regression. He was an existing academic who was coming from another college where he had taught, and apparently where I had gone. And he was asking me to be his geometry professor at this new college in Amherst. And I described how I remained a geometry professor at Amherst until the Civil War, which of course was 1861 to 65. So we're talking a good 40, 50 years as a geometry professor.
Wow.
I haven't found that guy's name yet, but I'm probably going to be able to identify who I was in that life as the geometry professor upon the founding of Amherst, because I was the only one there teaching geometry or mathematics. And then there were a couple more people who joined and taught, trigonometry and calculus and so forth. But I remained the geometry professor at that college for a good 40 or 50 years. I remember reading through as an elderly professor, I remember reading through the newspapers about the death of fellow students of mine who'd been killed in the Civil War, and feeling absolutely devastated by that fact. These bright young people I had taught had gone on and grown up a little bit, but then lost their life, or maybe sometimes not at all, and were almost the same age. They'd left college and gone to the war and were being killed in battle during the Civil War. So I'm going to probably be able to find out who that was, just as I've proven through investigation a number of my other identities. One of them, and this may be of interest to your audience, I don't know, but in light of my time travel and Mars visitation experiences, I was Dr. Thomas Bond, who was a Philadelphia physician involved in the American Revolution. I've often thought that it may be in compensation of that lifetime that I was allowed to do things for the government in this lifetime, and to meet Washington again, because I had met Washington in that life when Benjamin Franklin came to me in an alleyway under British curfew. And I remember saying to him, "Ben, how's your gout?" And he said, "As infernal as ever." And I've since learned that Franklin suffered terribly from gout. But I also remember that Franklin started the thing called drawing rooms. A drawing room ostensibly was to draw the public into your house. But actually, Franklin, as the initial DCI, Benjamin Franklin was the original director of Central Intelligence. As what? As the Postmaster General of the United States. He was our first Postmaster General. And that's why the U.S. Post Office has the right to open up our mail.
Wow.
Because the U.S. Post Office, as well as the Vatican confessional, was the foundation of the U.S. intelligence community.
Interesting.
Okay.
Wow.
So I remember Franklin talking to me about the fact that he was going to start these things called drawing rooms to draw the public, ostensibly to draw the public into our houses. But what we were actually doing after, tea and crumpets were served at those, 7:30 meetings on Tuesday nights was plan the American Revolution. So I had actually served as Dr. Thomas Bond. I had actually served in organizing the American Revolution with Franklin and others, and there were many civilians working on that attempt to free our country from the British. And that's discussed in Walter Semke's book, The Return of the Revolutionaries. There seems to be a real spate of baby boomers and Gen Xers, particularly culturally deployed ones. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, he believes that Marion Williamson was Abigail Adams. It seems seemingly a number of people from the American Revolution have come back. I know he believed that Bill Clinton was Peyton Randolph, the president of the Constitutional Convention. And so I remember, and I've actually proven my life as Dr. Thomas Bond, the Philadelphia physician who, among other things, in terms of being involved in the revolution, had pioneered amputations. I remember actually almost being choked to death by this young man whose leg I was removing because it had been crushed by a carriage. So what I'm saying is that because I'm a servant of the truth, I have to reveal that Project Pegasus was my first exposure to being regressed to a past life, but I was talking about my other past lives before then, even as young as age 2.5.
Wow.
Okay. When I would go to my mother or my 4 older siblings, and I would make some statement about somebody I had been in the past.
Wow. And
I was not even reading at that time. Mm-hmm. And I certainly wasn't watching very much television. But when I was 8 or 9 years old in 1970, I'm not sure exactly when it was, I pegged it at fall of 70 in my book. They regressed us, and I came up with the name of the founder of Amherst when she asked me, who was this gentleman who founded Amherst, who hired you as his geometry professor? And I quickly blurted out, Zephaniah. And Zephaniah Swiftmore was, in fact, the founder of Amherst. So this is consistent with Claude Swanson's book, The Science of the Soul. There seem to be a group of people on Earth who are essentially waking up to the transpersonal nature of their soul, that we cannot be killed. We live over and over and over again. Yeah. And so I because I'm a servant of the truth, I can't really deny that. And I'm often not, I often have an attempt by religionists to knock down my past life memories because, the Bible says every man is born once and then the judgment, but that's just silliness compared to what I remember and have remembered since I was a small child. I've recovered things from these people's memories that, from their lives that there's no way I should know. Mm-hmm. I've identified a very obscure Native American chief from the upper Midwest. It was probably an Ojibwe, but his name was Big Otter. Now, who making up a story about past lives is going to say that they were Big Otter, right? They come up with Sitting Bull or something, right?
Big Otter.
Some famous Native American. But Big Otter has been written about. I found a story about him in a book. I was in an airport. I was just wasting time. And I went to the kind of small little bookstore they had. And I opened up a book about Native American literature. And it literally opened to a page about Chief Big Otter. And I had described Chief Big Otter under past life regression 20 years earlier when I was in my early 30s. I continued to pursue past life regression because I had done it as such a small kid.
Wow.
And I had seen, I recovered that life as a geometry professor. And the whole thing kind of grew in my life, but I haven't really discussed it very much because I was afraid that my time travel or my Mars visitation experiences might be eclipsed by a belief either that I'm just a storyteller, I'm just a paranormal researcher who was embellishing or making up my time travel and Mars experiences, but I wasn't. I have been sharing the truth, so I kind of obscured my fascination with exploring my past lives. But I've done that extensively now, and especially after the loss of my vision, I've recovered a lot of information.
Wow. Yeah, your other senses are getting more heightened, I bet.
Yes, and I was able to not focus on what was right in front of me. I mean, I just watched Curse of Oak Island and Beyond Oak Island last night with Marty and Rick Lagina on the History Channel, and I hadn't seen that in 3 years. So I was always focused on something terribly interesting like that show, mm-hmm. and I wasn't focusing on my Pegasus or my Mars experiences enough, and I had kind of abandoned my past life research. I had even forgotten a lot of my paranormal experiences. So having the vision problem that I had enabled me to begin by narrating my paranormal experiences to a friend, which became a trilogy, mm-hmm. and then do my Pegasus book and then my Mars book, and now I'm completing one of my past lives. So it's all good. It's all the truth. And the past life book is supported by what the Department of Defense told me 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. So this goes to my work in the truth movement. This is why I'm talking about it, not to indulge storytelling about my past lives, although I enjoy doing so because I remember who I was in a number of cases. But because we were supposed to be the flowering of the Enlightenment as a country. Mm-hmm. What are we doing keeping back the fact that 50 years ago, the U.S. Department of Defense proved the existence of our souls?
Right.
It's still treated as a religious belief of some people, mm-hmm. if they choose to believe it. And to believe something means to apprehend something without evidence. Mm-hmm. To know something means to apprehend something with evidence.
Yeah,
So my point is, past life existence, the immortality of the soul, the eternal nature of the soul, despite the fact that our bodies are, at least initially, are mortal, mm-hmm. is not a belief. It's being treated as a belief, but it is knowledge. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that a Michio Kaku has tried to spread information about physics, I'm trying to do the same regarding spirituality. I don't think the U.S. government ever should have covered this up.
No.
So part of my work in the truth movement will be dedicated to discussing what I know about my past lives and what I discovered working for the government, that we are indeed eternal souls, fundamentally.
Yes. Yeah. And I can corroborate that with my own personal experience, because that's what I believe most, because I've actually lived it. In the early 80s, I left my body. I was doing a astral projection, and the guy on the radio said to put your hands over your chest and relax and sit up without sitting up. And I came out of my belly and I was a round ball. I could see in all directions. And I looked at my body at some point and I realized that most of my memories and experiences are in that body, but I had no connection to it. And that's when I realized I'd lived many, many other lives as well. So my own, at the time, I was a scientific evolutionist. I didn't believe in spirit. So that was a big eye opener for me. So I can, you know, from my own personal experience, I can corroborate that yeah, our soul is a very magical thing. It's what animates us, and it lives on forever.
And when it's out of body, it is a sphere. There's certainly strong evidence that it is. And let me just mention something about the authorship of this book and my experiences, just to prove to readers that I'm not valorizing it. When I was 5 years old and we were being checked out for what Pegasus would do to us, this was in summer of 1967, there was a villain on the project. This villain was doing something that nobody should ever do, and that's molest children.
Oh my God.
He took myself and about 10 other kids behind his home in West Caldwell, New Jersey, and subjected them to different forms of rape.
Oh my God.
And when he came over to me and placed his male member in my mouth, I bit it. I bit it severely.
Good for you. Oh my God.
Yeah. And when my dad came to pick me up, he asked me why this good doctor, this physician who was testing us to see how we would respond to just basic levels of electromagnetic stimulation, was actually taking us behind his house and overstimulating us and then committing pedophilia on these poor kids who were in the program.
Horrifying.
Now look, if I was trying to valorize myself in a form of sort of one-upsmanship, like, oh, this is a greater time travel story than, let's say, Al Bielix or whatever, do you think that anybody approaching age 60 who is a distinguished lawyer who has run for president would talk about being molested at age 5 in the program? I give the guy's name. I don't give the names of any of the children. I have some suspicion of who some of the other kids were, but they were a collection of about 12 boys and girls, including myself, that this evil bastard, he was a physician from another country, I won't say on the air what country it was molesting, vaginally, anally, orally, etc.
Oh my God.
So when he engaged me in some forced oral copulation, he got a payback, and I practically bit his male member in half.
Good for you.
Now when I was in college, now this was in 67, when I was in college in 1982, 15 years later, he placed a photocopy of a black and white photograph of his male member in my pigeonhole at Reaver Hall at UCLA. And he was stalking me on the UCLA campus. This was somebody who I had bitten and who my father, Jack Pruitt, and Paul Weber, 3 of the guys on the project, had gone back over to his house after I revealed to my father that he was molesting the kids on the program. And they practically killed him. Good. My dad actually I'm actually kind of proud of this because this is what I think pedophiles deserve, but he actually broke a wooden chair over the guy's back, one of those old stiff school chairs.
Wow.
In the principal's office, Yeah. He actually broke it over his back, and the guy was whimpering and begging for his life.
Wow.
Now, he doubled back, and he was stalking me on the UCLA campus. Why did I not know who it was? Well, because it was an early memory, and I was 5 when I encountered this guy. Now I'm encountering him at age 20, So this is one of the dangers to what the intel community was imposing on individuals by wiping their memories. That's why I'm so angry about the memory wiping that was done with Mars. Any one of us could have been killed to shut us up without even remembering what we were part of.
Right.
But anyway, I would just point out that particular story in the book. I included it because, look, if you're willing to talk about everything that has happened to you without any fear or favor, for good or ill, it means you're telling the truth. Mm-hmm. Because life involves bad things as well as good things. And it's naive to it's clearly a threat to the validity of a story like this if somebody is constantly portraying themselves as being a victor where nobody gets killed and, they're being attacked by predators and they're surviving and all this. I don't want to name names here, but in reality, several of the Mars claimants have taken the account of those of us who really went, and they've engaged in a form of one-upsmanship.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't go to Mars for hours at a time. I went for 17 years. Okay. Well, if Randy Kramer, for example, had really gone to Mars, why did he tell Dr. Michael Salla that his wife on Mars was Deirdre, but a few years later he told me her name was Doris? Is anybody who falls in love and gets married on another planet, whose beloved dies in their arms after being attacked by a predator, going to forget her name? No, I don't think so. So there are threats to the validity of these types of stories that can be readily identified. I don't want to criticize my countrymen and women, but the American people have been inadequate in terms of using the necessary discretion to determine who's been telling the truth and who's been making up science fiction stories in this area.
Yeah.
It's lent itself to both people who really did the things we've talked about coming forward. We wouldn't have had White Crow or Ken Johnston if Stillings and Mendez and I hadn't come forward. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's allowed complete nonsense to be made up by a Randy Kramer, a Michael McIntosh, and so forth. Mm-hmm. I don't know about some of the new Mars claimants, but I have disproven Michael McIntosh and Randy Kramer's stories as primarily based on my own, but also to some extent on not only exaggerating what I did, but some of the other Mars astronauts. So imagine if after going, and landing on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin would have had to prove what they did against the negative effect of those making up stories. That's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's why I've done my exo-hoaxer shows, to explain, wait a minute, we're not talking about a group of experiencers and everybody's got their story. I know people in the truth movement have alleged that. No, we're talking about people who really did things versus people who are jumping on the bandwagon and making up nonsense that never happened. Why, for example, after we had the jump rooms, would somebody have to take some huge craft to Mars? Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. We were able to go up there in ones and twos and three people at a time. There was no need to launch some 300-person ship. But does saying you went to Mars on a 300-person vessel impress people who have others who are telling the truth, have told them that they went there through an elevator-like device with one or two other people at most? No. You see, so this is what's going on, is those making up science fiction fantasies, the most clever among them, like Randy. Randy's a clever guy, but they've made up stories based on an exaggeration of our claims. So they'll steal the limelight, steal the thunder, because they're more wild stories. And that's the nature of storytelling in general. I mean, everybody loves a good ghost story, but everybody really loves a really unbelievable ghost story. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. And I'm not angry. I'm not angry, but I do think the record has to be set straight. And I've gone against the grain of the belief. Even Dr. Salla told me, Andy, don't worry about being the arbiter of other people's stories in the truth movement, because ultimately the truth will come out. Well, that's not what's been happening. What's his name? Len Kasten did a book about Mars in which he focused on Randy Kramer. Well, okay, we can allow science fiction fantasy to supplant journalism and science, but it's still wrong. It still screws up our understanding of what's really happened. So I took the opposite position that Michael was urging me to explore, and that is, I think, to the extent that we have to defend the truth, we also have to speak out against untruth, also known as falsehood. And that has, unfortunately, contaminated the truth movement in a major way. And that's why I bring it up today.
Okay. But it is my belief that even if some of these people aren't telling the full truth, there's probably something like that that's been happening. And in the negative void of not being told what's happening, these stories can come in. Now, I want to ask you a question about when you used to jump to Mars. I think I remember you saying once that there was a reptilian that would be like checking you in. Is this what happened?
No, there was a reptoid predator that was about 16 feet tall and looked like a T-Rex, although its head looked disconcertingly chicken-like from the side, and had a rather large body, but it was a supple velociraptor body that could run at about 70, 80 miles per hour.
Wow.
And I not only witnessed a water buffalo-like creature being taken down by one of those, but I watched one of my colleagues literally being bitten in half with it, and his blood and guts hit us at the feet.
Oh my God.
And I watched, he was about a 45-year-old guy named Bob, kind of a chubby guy. And a blonde kid from California named David, who was 16 years old.
Wow.
And so I watched two colleagues being killed by the reptoid predator. Now, there was also one of the other two lethally predators was an insectivoid predator that looked basically like a big grasshopper with like 10 legs, 10 or 12 legs, and big saber-toothed teeth in the front. And that thing was basically just like a chewing machine. It could just go through something incredibly fast. If that had killed us, we would have died quickly because we just would have been shredded.
Wow.
But Brett Stillings and I ran away from one of those. It was behind a rock, and I was using my psychic ability to see it. And I said, Brett, do not take another step. I said, Brett, and he just walk a little bit further. Don't go any farther. And I said, Brett, on the count of 3, let's run in this direction. And I pointed where we were going. And then when he walked totally around the rock and saw this thing just lurking there, ready to eat us, I said, 1, 2, 3, and we ran for about a mile in the opposite direction. So Brett and I ran away from one of the insectivoids, but and he saw the killing of David. That was in May of '84. That was, I think, the last jump that I did, or one of the last. I read about it in the book. Something strange happened in terms of time-space effects during that jump. When we went back to rescue David's body and take it home, just to give it a decent burial on Earth, everything repeated, but with the additional dimension that we knew it was repeating. So we were talking about what we had previously just done that day, and it was repeating, but we were also adding to it our new commentary. And then that happened a third time. A second time we had a quantum loop. Bernard Mendez was so disturbed by what was happening, he didn't go on that third jump. He just stayed back in El Segundo.
Wow.
But we went back to Mars the third time that day, and everything repeated. So there was clearly some kind of quantum effect going on that is unexplained. It has something to do with the technology.
Interesting.
But there was an insectivoid, and as you mentioned, a reptoid predator, but there were no reptilians checking us in. That may be from Randy Kramer's account, in the sense that he has taken the bipedal humanoids that we interacted with, the Homo martus terris and the Homo martus martus, which were quite human-looking and two-legged, and superimposed or conflated that detail with these other predators, one being 4-legged and one being like 10-legged, and they were not bipedal predators. So I had no contact with reptilian bipedal creatures on Mars.
Okay, now
but I remember, certainly.
Maybe I'm remembering it wrong then, because, or maybe someone else's testimony, but I could have sworn that you were saying that this program was meant for not just the military, and they had to prove that it wasn't just for the military by having civilians come and be part of the program, including future leaders, which would be
that was sort of a dimension, in the sense that, look, some of the people remember that we were in the program were H. Ross Perot, Mary Jean Eisenhower, Barack Obama, then named Barry Soetoro, and myself. And those four individuals, Perot, Obama, and Basiago ran for president, and Mary Jean Eisenhower served ably and well for many years as the president of the People-to-People Ambassadors Program that her grandfather, Dwight David Eisenhower, started when she was 1 year old, back in 1956.
Wow.
So there seemed to be some attempt to include those who were destined, or at least would try to to reach the U.S. presidency. One of them has so far succeeded, and that's Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
Perot, of course, is gone. I don't know, in light of my vision, whether I'll be able to run. At some point, I'll probably be announcing what ultimately the final conclusion is on my vision. I don't want to run if I'm not going to be able to read and read people well enough. I kind of can read people well enough facially, but I cannot read. So I probably won't be running if that doesn't improve. There's indications that's going to improve because of technology coming along. But yeah, there was an attempt to involve civilians in leadership capacities. But then again, other people I met on the surface was that CIA director for Carter. I'm blanking on his name. Stansfield Turner. When Stansfield Turner joined up on the surface with Bernard Mendez one time, I thought he was the Bigfoot researcher Peter Byrne. Remember the fancy cravats and sort of safari suits that Peter Byrne would wear?
Mm-hmm.
Because Stansfield Turner looked like Peter Byrne so much, I thought, oh great, they put one of the prominent Bigfoot hunters up here, or they let him come up here, and that made sense to do. By the way, they should have let Peter Byrne go up there, or one of the other prominent Bigfoot researchers, Sasquatch researchers, because there are Sasquatch on Mars. They're just a little bit smaller than ours. They're about 6 feet tall.
Wow! But
they're all covered in hair and very much like this. The Sasquatch that have been encountered on this planet. So, and they have been. They're not a myth. They're not a legend.
Right.
They exist. In fact, Bernard Mendez taped some Sasquatch that were running outside of Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico and clocked them at 120 miles per hour.
Whoa.
He was chasing them with a helicopter.
Wow.
So anyway, Stansfield Turner was one of the people I met up there. So there was a Navy connection because of course Stansfield Turner and Ross Perot had gone to the Naval Academy together, Annapolis. William Cameron McCool, who was trained with my group, was at the Naval Academy. I was supposed to go to the Naval Academy, and in fact, Alfred Lambermont Weber dates my joining of the Truth Movement when I refused to go to the meeting that was scheduled between myself and Congressman Barry Goldwater Jr. of Woodland Hills, California. He was my local congressman, because they had greased the skids for me to go to the Naval Academy. I had regret for a number of years at UCLA that I hadn't gotten that free ride at the Naval Academy and hadn't learned how to sail and do other things that it would have involved. I did end up learning scuba diving when I was attached to Mars, because I was training with the Naval ROTC unit at UCLA. But I did not go to the Naval Academy, but was supposed to. And my dad was quite angry about that. But I basically said to him, Dad, I don't want to be yelled at for 4 years. And to the extent that, I wasn't treated very well in the project we were in, I just don't want to now go in, go from the frying pan into the fire and go to one of those academies. They basically spend 4 years tearing you down just to build you up.
Right. And
also teach you how to push other people around. And I didn't want to be killed, but I also didn't want to kill. I'm not a pacifist. I do believe in the doctrine of just war, but I believe we go to war too readily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have as a country, we have only been not at war for something like 17 years since our founding. Yeah. And 4 of those years were under one of the Americans that I view as one of the greatest living Americans, and that's James Earl Carter.
Yeah, Carter.
Jimmy Carter kept us out of war for 4 years.
Yeah, he did. And he did a lot of things. One big thing he did was, I remember he put a sweater on. He did a PSA, put a sweater on. At the White House, we're turning our thermostat down to 68. You should too. We can get through this energy crisis. So, he was really leading by example.
Right. He's a great man.
Yeah.
And I love Jimmy Carter. Yeah. And I think that people who readily criticize his presidency, well, there were issues of whether his meticulous style of detail was less effective than, let's say, Ronald Reagan's, sort of one-page, half-hour approach. I think as president, you do have to delegate a lot. And perhaps President Carter cared so much that he wasn't delegating enough. You know, there are historical arguments like that we can make, but he's a great man.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
So when I was presented with the opportunity to literally go to Annapolis, I recognize, you know, the brave men and women who have done so and have even lost their lives defending our country. But I really think that as a species, we have to move beyond war. War is basically legally sanctioned mass murder.
Yes. Yes.
Now, sometimes it's just if you're confronted with legally sanctioned mass murder, or the killing or abuse of innocence, or you need to save the freedom of all. And so I do recognize the doctrine of just war, but not, I don't believe that we should readily go to war.
Right. And
I think that the presidents who do so are being compromised. I've got my own ideas of how they're being compromised, but I'd rather not discuss that on this show.
Right. Okay.
But maybe someday we can discuss that.
Yeah.
And so I decided not to go to Annapolis, and that really bothered my dad. He even said after I served on Mars that you didn't serve because I didn't put myself in a capacity to be shot at. But boy, I don't think he realized how frequently on Mars I could have been eaten.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I had been told by Courtney Hunt that I had earned the Space Medal of Honor when I carried Bernard Mendez about a mile on my shoulder when he collapsed on the surface.
Wow. And
that was virtually impossible because the oxygen on Mars is enough to breathe unassisted, but it's kind of where oxygen levels are on Earth at about 12,000 to 14,000 feet above sea level.
Yeah.
It's like being somewhere between the last post office and the first camping spot on Mount Everest.
Yeah.
And it was really difficult. I had to put Bernie down on the ground 3 times to just carry him a mile. I was like 180 pounds at that time, and he was 160.
Wow.
Because we had weighed in before going up there.
Wow.
And I thought I can either leave this friend and colleague there on the surface, whereupon he will be eaten, or I can just tough this out and carry him to the Jumproom facility. It was the one that we called the corkscrew because of its conch shell shape. And so I had been told, and I mentioned this to President Trump in my recent letter. I said, you know, look, Mr. President, I was awarded the Space Medal of Honor, and then I've never given it. And what's the deal?
Oh, that would be great. I mean, he could give that to you. That would be awesome. Yeah.
I even think there were some college professors at Lewis and Clark, where I was enrolled from 1988 to 91, who must have had connections to the intel community, because from the get-go, some of them were just totally conciliatory and friendly towards me. But one of them was just, I don't want to mention who it was, but one of them was just going out of his way to say hi to me every time he would pass me in the hall, like, oh, here's the one who was on Mars who, you know, they told me was secretly awarded the Space Medal of Honor. You know, but I'd like to be awarded that because, you know, it was not easy to do that. And I was told by the CIA that I had won that. And so I raised a number of issues with President Trump, including, you know, we were promised, for example, interest-free loans to buy a single-family detached home of whatever size in Redding, California, because they were planning on making Redding to the Mars astronauts what Houston is to the Apollo astronauts, or the Mercury Gemini Apollo astronauts. And they did not keep that promise. They promised us cradle to the grave revolving door of government service. Well, Obama and Dugan got that. Barack Obama and Regina Dugan were trained with me, and they certainly served a lot in government, or at least Regina ultimately became the first woman and 19th director of DARPA, and President Obama became a 2-term president. So they're in the government pension system as a result, but the rest of us are not. We were cheated of everything. In fact, it's hard to believe how chintzy the Reagan years were, and this is why I remain a lifelong Democrat. But let me just say something sort of political, and that is, guess what the amount and number of checks I was paid for going to the Red Planet numerous times?
0.
During those That's close. The Reagan years weren't that bad in terms of equity of salary. But I went to Mars about 40 times between July of 1981 and May of 1984, and I was paid 2 checks, one for $55 and one for $34.
Oh, my.
Now, those checks were on not the Office of Naval Intelligence letterhead, but the Department of Naval Intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the only place that any of us have been able to find, a number of us have looked for that agency to determine who paid us those checks. The only story it emerges in is that of Robert Lazar and his experiences in Area 51, seeing the downed ET craft.
Mm-hmm.
There is officially no Department of Naval Intelligence. The Navy Department exists, and it's really the fundamental intelligence agency. It's actually directing the government. The Office of Naval Intelligence exists, but the Department of Naval Intelligence is simply not listed. And so again, I think that Robert Lazar was being truthful by even sharing that data point, because William Stillings and I remember that those checks were on Department of Naval Intelligence letterhead.
Wow.
And then of course we weren't paid at all. We weren't paid our salary. I was supposed to earn $30,000 when I left Pegasus in 1972. That was supposed to be posted in trust until my 25th birthday, which would have been 9/18/86. And my dad and I went over to the Army Adjutant's office at Curtis Wright, and he said, "We're not paying Andy his benefits." And he and my dad had an argument, a very loud argument, for over an hour.
Wow.
And then when my dad and I left Curtis Wright that day, we were surrounded by 2 military MPs who literally sort of frog marched us to our car.
Wow.
I think to probably intimidate my dad.
Wow.
But my father was just livid. But despite that fact, because of his patriotism, he continued to work for the Department of Defense, and he enrolled me in the Mars program. So maybe it was because he'd been told that, he had based his decision on the fact that he was told during the preview to the training program what we were going to be paid, and I would finally be remunerated for working for our government. But in fact, I was cheated again.
Well, now, can't you just write up a bill and send it to all of the Navy departments, send them a bill, and give a copy of the bill to Courtney Hunt, your CIA agent?
Well, Courtney died at least a good 10 years ago, perhaps more than that, maybe 2006 or 7.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember exactly when it was. It was certainly, I moved in 07, so it was before then. So he's deceased.
Okay.
Almost all the officials on Pegasus are dead. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons I spoke out, because there was no basis to recover financially for what I did. I kind of feel that if the government had kept its word to my father regarding what I was supposed to earn for Pegasus, and if they had kept their word to me personally for going to Mars, I might not have come forward. I might have said, well, you paid me.
Mm-hmm.
This was supposed to remain secret.
Right.
But in fact, their failure to remunerate those working for them was a leading cause of me coming forward. And I want those listening to understand that.
Yeah.
It violates biblical principle not to pay the workman before nightfall. Scripture literally says, pay, I think it's in Psalms or something, pay the workman's wages before nightfall. The idea is you don't gather the value of somebody's labor and then delay their pay.
Right.
That's very much consistent, by the way, with ethical Judaism, which is very ethical. And I've had many Jewish friends and have learned things about Judaism that have really guided my own conduct in life. Mm-hmm. Although I was born and raised as a Roman Catholic. But, you're supposed to pay the workman's wages before nightfall so that you don't garner his sweat equity off his brow and get advantage from it until you do pay him, or maybe not pay him at all. So that's what our government was not doing. Now, according to Courtney Hunt, when he was still talking, he had a stroke that made him unable to talk toward the end there. But he told me when he was still conversant that something like 50,000 Americans who had served our government were being cheated in this way.
Wow.
Now, of course, the career officials like him were not cheated. They were even receiving secondary pay through things like oil companies. You know, there's different forms of payment that intel officials get. When I was at Cambridge, I was approached by ASIO, the Australian Strategic Intelligence Organization, and they were urging me to go back to Cambridge, where I'd earned my Master of Philosophy in land economy, get the PhD there, which Sir Malcolm John Grant had offered me to do, and then come to Australia, apply for a job at Australian National University, and then I would be picked up by ASIO, and I would have two salaries. According to, and I didn't do that. I decided I didn't want to become an intelligence agent. I had always wanted to be a writer and lawyer, and that's what I became instead. But Courtney Hunt told me that there was like salary and then gold bank shares and just also money over the transom by which U.S. intelligence officials are paid. They'll literally walk into a commercial bank, and there's one teller there that pays off, let's say, the CIA people in town. Mm. And if I joined CIA, that's how I'd be paid, 3 ways. So he was being paid by like the CIA, Exxon, and some oil shares from Exxon. A lot of the people on Pegasus were being paid in Texas and Oklahoma oil and natural gas stocks because they could not speculate on initial public offerings of stocks they learned about in the program. Because, you know, imagine if everybody in the program started buying up Microsoft the day before its initial public offering, right? They could not gamble on the future information they knew. They couldn't invest favorably or privateer, as it was called. They were literally legally restricted from privateering. But how many Americans know that U.S. intelligence officials are paid 2 or 3 ways? Or that, you know, that professor there at Australian National University has a second job as an intelligence agent with, actually specifically what they wanted me to do is be an environmental professor, but an exopolitical intelligence operative. So I would teach environmental law and policy during the day, and then I would go to conferences about the extraterrestrial situation or whatever, and just sort of permeate the culture the way that Michael Salla has, or Alfred Weber, you know, any of our leading exopoliticians. So anyway, despite the fact that intelligence agents are paid handsomely, many operatives are not paid at all. And the group that the American intelligence agencies was using unconscionably were young people. They were using, they figured, look, if this person is in a special program and has to deal with this, you know, if Andy has to deal with time travel when he's, you know, 8, 9, 10 years old, and we see here by looking forward in time that he becomes this distinguished lawyer who runs for president and writer, and here are his 25 books. Connie Chavez, a friend of my dad's on the project, said that I would be publishing dozens of major works. They came up with all these excuses saying, well, this person's going to be eminent regardless of whether we pay them, and they elected to keep the program secret by not paying the kids involved.
Wow. I say, you know, all the money they owe you, compounded interest, you know, I think you got a case there. I think you should present that somehow.
I do have a case, but I've actually consulted 3 distinguished lawyers. I don't think they would mind if I mention who they are. That's J.J. Sandlin of Yakima, Washington, Gregory S. Kafori of Kafori and McDougall of Portland, Oregon, and Dennis Palmieri of Malibu, California. And these are 3 lawyers that I know and respect and are friends of mine, and they're certainly great trial lawyers. I mean, Greg Kafori has done court TV, I think, about 15 times now or more.
Wow. JJ
was featured on 60 Minutes when he was representing the apple growers in the ALAR lawsuit that the NRDC brought against. And Dennis has done very prominent cases as well. And, these are three lawyers who are in the $5, $10, $20 million lawsuit range. And they all basically gave me different responses. JJ said, Andy, I believe you. In fact, I think you're one of the most brilliant lawyers in the country for proving your time travel claims in the court of public opinion. I believe you went to Mars too, and I can look up where you're listed there with the Naval Investigative Service. But if I do so and sue on your behalf, they'll kill you. And that was from somebody who had served as a commander for the Navy as an aviator over Vietnam. In fact, one time JJ was almost came in. He thought he was coming in with his wings inverted 90 degrees, but his instruments were all saying that he was coming in for a safe landing. So he actually landed his plane on an aircraft carrier that was hopping all over the sea when it looked like the tips of his wings were going to smash into the surface of the aircraft carrier.
Wow.
But his instruments were telling him otherwise, and he saved himself and his co-pilot by coming in. He would have had a ditch in the ocean otherwise.
Wow.
So he said I would be killed if I brought it forward. Greg Kafori was convinced that my story was so unbelievable that I had to have had some kind of trauma in my past that led to believing it. And I said, well, I've had a number of traumas in my life, like anybody, Greg. I was molested. I was hit on the head by a baseball bat in a full swing one time accidentally.
Oh, my.
When I was a small kid. I fell off my bike violently a couple times, etc. But no, my dad was in this program. We talked about it when I was, 28 years old before his death. And I was in law school. It's not something of recent, fabrication.
Yeah.
And then Dennis Palmieri probably said the most intelligent thing of what's going on, which is in order to protect secret programs that the executive branch is running, primarily the president, the entire executive branch, the judiciary of this country is declaring all such claims like mine either fanciful under 12b1 or failure to state a claim under 12b6. In other words, the judges elect, the federal, whether it's a FISA court, there's a little bit more of a chance if I took used FISA to get in. But then if I agreed to a FISA court settlement, I might have to agree not to tell my story. And I don't want to do that.
Right.
So that's a complication of a FISA court action. The complication with just an open court, federal district court action is leading lawyers like this have already told me that, look, these cases are not getting to trial. The federal district court judges just declare, okay, 12b1, fanciful, 12b6, failure to state a claim, and they bounce you out of court, sometimes imposing court fees and sometimes actually fining you for bringing a frivolous or false claim before the court.
Wow.
So believe it or not, even after serving in these two classified defense-related research and development programs at risk of my life, one from age 6 to age 11, one from age 19 to 22, where I literally went off planet, if I bring this in front of the very federal district court that I am a member of in good standing, and have been since 2014, which is the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington, even if I bring it in front of my own court that I'm admitted to at the federal level, I can be fined for bringing the truth to our judiciary.
Wow.
What that means, and what I'm sharing with all other Americans, because I went to law school to pursue justice on behalf of people, is we have to know that the American judicial system is not a justice system. It is a law system, and it is corrupt. So dispense with, unless we change our country, which I also support, by the way, and literally bring in a new government with a new form of just law, do not expect justice from American judges. They're just not offering it.
Wow. That's really sad that there's so much corruption. It's just, I mean, we could use the chronovisor to figure out who's corrupt and put them in jail.
Right, and they could use a chronovisor to show us on Mars or show us in training.
Yeah, they could.
There are 6 million Americans in prison. Now, according to the American Bar Association, 10% of them, or 600,000 Americans, are behind bars, caged like animals, because they pled guilty to an offense or a set of offenses that they were not guilty of, because they were told that they would get a lesser included offense.
Right.
And they would spend less time in jail.
Right.
Okay. I spent, off and on, I spent from 2010 to 2019 trying to get an innocent man who was convicted of statutory rape when he was 22 for supposedly having sexual intercourse with his 12-year-old neighbor, after she came forward with a recantation when she was 18, and when she was 26 years old. She came forward and stated, look, I was 12 years old. My mother had made a pass at this guy. He had rebuffed that pass. She hated this guy, and she falsely accused him of raping me, statutory rape.
Wow.
And she, who was his chief accuser at age 12 when he was 22, spent 8 years placing that evidence, and I was the lawyer placing it before the appellate court in Washington State. Now think about Washington, a totally majoritarian Democratic state, a state like with Oregon, and to a lesser extent Northern California, on strong labor tradition. It was featured in that book, Labor's Untold Story. A frontier state that you would think would have a sense of justice. It took 9 years to get an innocent man out of jail, when the sole accuser, who was 12 when she was making those accusations, was stating in a signed, notarized letter that went on for pages and pages about what had happened and how he had been wrongly accused by her. That all of her testimony at trial was false. She had perjured herself. Mm-hmm. Now, she even wrote that letter and had it notarized at my behest against penalty of perjury. She could have gone to prison for perjury.
Wow.
And she was doing it because she felt so distressed that this innocent man was going to jail, or was still in jail.
Wow.
So we're really in danger of losing our country, or any semblance of it, when we look at the abuse of the criminal justice system, that 10% of those even in jail could be innocent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
600,000 fellow Americans. I mean, that's almost like a judicial holocaust.
Yes.
And we need to start talking about it.
Yeah, indeed. I spent one night in the local jail. And when I told my lawyer why I was arrested, he said, well, let's sue the city. So he filed the paperwork, because I was sitting quietly on my couch when I was arrested. I wasn't doing anything. And so we filed the papers, and the police station said he was never arrested. He never spent a night. He never saw the judge, which I did. So they expunged the record to cover their tracks.
Well, an expungement is actually good for you, because it means you have no criminal history.
Right.
Like,
right. But I
federal business loan stuff.
I couldn't sue the city, which sounds like kind of like a fun thing to do, since they threw me in the slammer for no reason. But I also tape recorded the whole arrest, and that tape was removed from my tape player and destroyed.
Well, you could have, you could have sued them for wrongful imprisonment and
I could
wrongful prosecution.
Yeah. But the chronovisor could help in a lot of ways. Now, I have one question that I've always remember hearing in your story about, on the surface of Mars, you said that you saw some plesiosaur like dinosaur, but I'm confused because a plesiosaur has fins. It's an aquatic.
Yes, right. A plesiosaur is an aquatic reptile.
Right.
It was killed off by the KT extinction, which
right.
we believe killed the dinosaurs.
Right.
It may have been photographed underwater at Loch Ness.
Mm-hmm.
A surviving plesiosaur. Certainly the Susan Mancy photograph of Lake Champlain.
Uh-huh.
We're not messy, but champ is
Champ,
right. Similar.
Right.
I decided to call it a plesiosaur because it's basically a terrestrial plesiosaur. It looks like the aquatic reptile that was killed off on Earth by the KT extinction.
Okay.
It has basically a very bulky body, a long neck like a snake, and a head like a horse. By the way, the writer Tim Cohen has found exceptionally good photographs of the plesiosaurs on Mars. According to Bernard Mendez, they are ubiquitous throughout the universe. They're a very common form of animal.
Wow. So
Now,
it does have legs. It has legs then, like front legs and back legs.
Yeah, it basically sits there like it's a boulder. And the second time I went to Mars, which was with Courtney Hunt, the first time was by myself, and I was joined on the surface by 3 Americans that were there. I never got their names, by the way. The second time, I went up by myself and Courtney Hunt. And when we were walking back to that same skull on the surface of Mars, there are many skulls. We at the Mars Anomaly Research Society have shown numerous photographs of the skulls on Mars. They're skulls, but sometimes they're so large. I mean, there are small ones, but there are such large skulls on the surface that you're able to run through the eye socket of the skull and find an underground passageway.
Okay.
And that's what Courtney and I were planning to do, because that's the eye that we had walked up to the surface from.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were doing so, I saw some movement over on my right. And I said, Courtney, I've got some movement over here. And then as we walked closer and closer to the skull, I said, yeah, that rock over there is moving, Courtney. And he said, yeah, it's a life form.
Wow.
And he said, at the count of 3, just run like hell at the eye socket of the skull and dive into it like you're diving into home base in a baseball game,
mm-hmm.
which I did. And then when we scampered down the stone stairwell down to the elevator-like contraption that was going to take us home, basically the jump room, which was parked there
mm-hmm. in
that particular place on Mars. See, we could go up from the one at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, which we had to go up to the 8th floor of that building, or we could go from one at a CIA building near the George Washington Bridge in New York City. So, but when we got on the surface, we would be deployed to one of the receiving stations, regardless of where we jumped from on Earth, the East Coast or the West Coast jump room.
Mm-hmm.
So we could go back to either of them in any of the jump rooms that we found on the surface. So Courtney and I elected to jump through that skull. And when we scampered down the steps, I said, is that a predator? Because it hadn't really been covered very much in our exobiological lectures with Ed Dames that summer, the previous summer before that, actually summer of 80 at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. And Courtney laughed derisively like only the cigarette smoking man from the CIA can laugh and said, hell yes, that thing has jagged teeth running all the way down its throat.
Mm-hmm. So
it was running at us to eat us, to attack us and eat us.
Wow.
But then there's sessile. A lot of the life forms on Mars are kind of sessile. They just kind of sit there. Because like when we had walked beyond that position, we saw these seal-like creatures that were laying on a sort of a ridge. And when we turned around and started walking back to the jump room facility, they started barking like seals.
Mm. Wow.
And Courtney said, I said, what's that? He said, they're saying goodbye to you. So they were certainly intelligent seals at that.
Wow.
So we ran and jumped through and just about made it. And then I was always cautious about boulders on the surface because just as was demonstrated in my landmark paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars in 2008. Now, by the way, that was mistitled because I, as a Cambridge grad, was trying to do something worthy of Darwin, an origin of the species.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't have called it The Discovery of Life on Mars. I should have just called it Life on Mars because, of course, I had been there. I had been trained in life on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of the discovery of life on Mars in the sense it was being introduced to the mass public, the general public.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not the discovery of life on Mars, and I'm quite, I admit that now. It was mistitled, but it was one of the first important papers showing what's there. There are a lot of plesiosaurs on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, for example, in that photograph.
Okay.
They're all over the place. But there's also like some snake-like creatures there that have the faces of humans. There's very strange life forms on Mars.
Wow.
Now, Tim Cohen is going to try to be building a theory that they were created by the Nephilim in kind of a gross distortion of life that the Creator God made on Earth. They're kind of like hybrid monsters that were created by a specific race of, fallen angels, as it were, something like that. I don't think we have enough information to make that conclusion.
Right.
But they certainly are a bizarre amalgam of Earth species. Now, that could have been from genetic engineering on Earth or in some ancient time. The High Egyptians were on Mars, and we know that from the wonderful finding of a face of a pharaoh that our late great friend Ross Curley found. That was taken on day 2012 of the rover Spirit's journey on Mars.
Wow.
It's actually called a soul on Mars. It's a little bit longer than a day.
Right.
But on the 20,012 soul that Spirit had on Mars, Ross found this. It's either a piece of metal or stone in one of the pictures from the rover Spirit, one of the NASA photographs from rover Spirit, where the face of the pharaoh is over kind of in the corner of the slab of rock or metal, so that it looks like, Pharaoh Akhenaten in front of the Great Pyramid. And we think possibly that's who it is, because of course Akhenaten was known as the sun god. And you look at references to Barack Obama's wife and two daughters, Renaissance. He was known by the Secret Service as a renegade, and Michelle was known, I think, as Renaissance, and the girls were like Radiance and something else, Rosebud or something. Well, all those are references to Akhenaten. And we have found a face of a multiracial individual, somebody with both European and Black African features, that strongly resembles Barack Obama on the face of Mars. So the existence of the High Egyptian civilization on Mars, or the fact that they came here from Mars, which would explain that Homo capensis head, the long head that Nefertiti had.
Right.
And the weird headdresses that they wore that looked like they were covering up this very long cranium.
Right.
Would possibly have originated on Mars, and that we were under the control of the Martians for a period of time.
Could be.
Now, the two Martian humanoid species that I met, the Homo martis terris and Homo martis martis, and also the very tiny ones, Homo martis de minimis, that we sometimes actually stepped on, unfortunately, which were humanoid, were not the creatures with the elongated heads that some of the Egyptian statuary depicts. But whatever the High Egyptian leaders were, they were on Mars. Whether they started there or went there, we don't know. There's different theories. I know different researchers have proposed different solutions, but I don't think we know enough to declare that. But is the fingerprint of the High Egyptian civilization on Mars? You betcha.
Right. Very, very interesting planet. And wow. I have another question I've been wondering about, and I'm going to ask you to dial your mind back to the Tesla Vortal teleporter. Now, you went from Morris Plains, New Jersey to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now,
no, actually, I never did that. That's where I was growing up.
Oh, okay.
And I loved that place. It was a great place to grow up.
But you went from somewhere in New Jersey. Somewhere in New Jersey.
To your listeners from Morris Plains. I loved Morris Plains growing up there. It's a great town, as is Morristown.
It sounds like Mars. Morris, Mars.
Yeah.
But
no, it was Robert. It was Morris for not Robert Morris, but I think Livingston Morris, and then the governor of New Jersey, or Governor Morris. Lewis Morris, an early governor of New Jersey.
Okay. But
I was jumping to Santa Fe when I was a kid from the Curtis Wright facility, from Building 68 of the Curtis Wright facility in Woodridge, New Jersey.
Woodridge. Okay, so you went from Woodridge, New Jersey to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, are there only certain areas, maybe energetic areas like those two, that you can jump between, or can you dial it in to go any place that you want to go, or does it have to be one of these main places?
We don't know. I know that these devices could be put anywhere.
Okay.
But that is to say, they were put in numerous places. Like, for example, if we jump through the Tesla teleporter in either New Jersey or New Mexico, and it weakened, we would be decanted across the street from the Swagelok headquarters in Solon, Ohio. Solon, Ohio.
Wow.
So there were multiple contact points to the teleportation network that was emerging when I was in the project.
Okay.
Now, the notion that ley lines were being selected because of, for example, the antiquity of the Lenni Lenape habitation of New Jersey and the Spanish territory in the Santa Fe, New Mexico area is really contrary to what I was told by the program, which is they were sending us back and forth between Lenni Lenape country and Woodridge, New Jersey, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, right in the heart of where Santa Fe had been a territory under the Spanish going back 400 years. Because if we were dislocated in time, there would be kind people there who would adopt us.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I have since heard from somebody investigating Santa Fe that child molestation and child sacrifice were actually pretty commonplace in Santa Fe. So I don't know if we were told the truth. I have heard no really scary stories about the Lenni Lenape Indians of New Jersey. My understanding is they were a very peaceful and beneficent tribe, the kind of Native American tribe that would literally, give food to strangers who wandered into their encampment and were not at war with other tribes or with European settlers to America. So what I was told is that's why they were sending us between those particular areas in New Jersey and New Mexico. Because if we jumped through the device in 1971 and it was 1791 when we got there, bear in mind that all rhythms on Earth, all biorhythms on Earth are 20-year cycles, even our own lives, that there would be somebody there to rescue us. We were, in fact, even trained in how to go to a Catholic priest, a prominent businessman, a county sheriff in New Mexico and say, look, my parents were killed on our migration to New Mexico. Can you adopt me if we found ourselves dislocated in time? Did that ever happen? Thank God, no. Except one time we jumped through the device in 1970, and it was 1991 when we got there.
Wow.
And we had to jump back to New Jersey in 20 years in an experience that was so violent that a guardian angel actually entered the Vortal Tunnel. It was a female. She was about 20 feet tall.
Wow.
And she brought us through the rest of the tunnel.
Wow.
That was the only time something truly paranormal happened to me in Project Pegasus.
Wow.
Now, I've had a bunch of other paranormal experiences. Like when I was 5 or 6, I actually left my body and went about 500 to 1,000 feet above the car that my mother was driving, and I could see it down below like a little, matchbox car.
Uh-huh.
So I was prone to being an experiencer as a kid. That may be why I was selected for the program. I was told by Courtney Hunt it was because I was psychically active as well as high IQ. So there was sort of, I think, a connection between Project Pegasus and Project Stargate in that sense.
Well, you were also building with your blocks as a 3-year-old child. You were making them stay in midair and circle each other like planets.
And my father had witnessed that. Now, bear in mind, my dad had a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he had done something like half of his course of studies in engineering, 1/4 in physics, and 1/4 in mathematics. So he was staring at me, thinking, now, how is my number 3 son, as he used to call me, how is my number 3 son levitating his blocks, which I was doing with my mind.
Wow.
So I was an experiencer, but in this particular experience, the other kids saw him too, because I talked to them afterwards. Not him, her. It was a female, and she was like a big form that just emerged in the center of the Vortal Tunnel, and she kind of took us under her protection and took us through the really violent part of the experience.
Wow.
So something non-ordinary happened. I guess we were not meant to die.
Interesting. Wow. That's
Yeah,
fantastic. I've never heard that before. Is that the first time you've mentioned that?
No, I've talked about how I had specialized training as captain of Blue Team.
Right.
And if there was ever a disaster, I was supposed to exercise that, that authority, that leadership.
Right.
And I did. I actually told the kids to calm down. And I said, look, if we're 20 years in the future, all we'll find when we go back to New Jersey is that our parents, will be 65 years old rather than 45 years old, or whatever age they are. And our older brothers and sisters will be out of college and probably also married, because they'll be, 30, 35, 40 years old.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we'll still be ourselves, and it'll still be New Jersey. It'll just be New Jersey 20 years in the future.
Right.
Which we were going to experience anyway. So I just try to get them to stop crying, because some were.
Wow.
And then I asked for the security director at the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds. And this gentleman came at about 7 o'clock. And I said, "Are you the security director for the whole state capitol grounds?" And he said, "No, that's my boss." And I said, "Well, sir, please get your boss, because I've been instructed to speak to the security director of the state capitol grounds."
Wow.
And so when that guy arrived, like a half hour later, I gave him my name. I said I was disabled or dislocated in the field, and I needed him to contact Sandia on behalf of me and tell them that I and my fellow teleportees had been displaced 20 years in the future. And he initially didn't believe me. And I said to him, "Sir, I know you don't believe me, but at the end of the day, I'm going to be 2,000 miles and 20 years from home. So go, please just call Sandy and they'll know what I'm talking about." Now, a guy about 40 years old with a ginger-colored Van Dyke beard, I don't know who he was, some physicist came up from Sandia, and he took roll of every last kid there. And we all answered yes, and then they drove us down by school bus to van to Sandia, and I couldn't believe how much traffic there was on I-25. That was never like that, because I was always going back and forth between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, or even down to Socorro with my dad, and there was hardly anybody on the street, right? That was, Albuquerque area, 1970. Well, 20 years in the future, 1991, was much more active than 1971 in New Mexico. I just couldn't believe the traffic.
Wow.
So when we got there, we said, "Kids, don't worry, we can get you home back to the time you left. We were waiting for you. But since then, we've lost some information about teleportation and we've gained some. But your experience of teleportation is not going to be quick, and it's going to be a lot more violent than you expected." So they dressed us in sort of spacesuits and masks. And I wouldn't say spacesuits, but protective tunics or suits and masks to breathe. And the way I've described that trip home, those 20 years home, was, and 2,005 miles home, was kind of like a bad LSD trip. I've never taken LSD.
Wow.
But it's what I've heard people talk about. It was just like being shot out of a cannon. It was very violent. Wow. And it was even a little painful, actually.
Wow.
There was massive buffeting. It was like, bah, 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 bah. There were all these noises inside the Vortal Tunnel that we never heard before.
Wow.
And we were just getting basically the stuffings knocked out of us. Wow. So like halfway through, and by the way, it took a half hour rather than a couple of seconds. So about 15 minutes into it, this huge angel formed in the center of the Vortal Tunnel and guided us home. But then even when she disappeared and we hit the tarmac at Curtis Wright, I hit it so, which is always where we would arrive back at Curtis Wright. We would hit the tarmac and then go into the engineering building. I hit the tarmac so hard on my back that my mask shattered.
Wow.
And they took me into the engineering building on a stretcher.
Wow.
I wasn't injured, but because I was a pretty hardy kid, I could hit the ground pretty hard and not be injured. I had a blocky head. But man, I really hit the ground hard.
Wow.
And that's when we came out of the Vortal Tunnel and we're back in ordinary time. It was like boom, and we were like thrown along the ground.
Wow.
So a number of us were taken off the tarmac in stretchers. Wow. And but we made it. But then when we were back in the learning lab where we were being trained back at Mount View Road School, which was my elementary school, one of the girls who had just joined our group was missing. She did not make it back.
Oh no.
So there, just as Courtney Hunt later told me, because Courtney was in Pegasus and Mars. In fact, the first time I met Courtney Hunt, he was coming in on the curtilage of the Cerritos Cultural Center right outside of Santa Fe. And the two then owners of that property asked him, well, where you been, Courtney? Time traveling? And he said, yeah. And they said, when and where? And he said, Los Angeles, 2200. And they tried to get him to explain what it was like. And the best I could understand is it's like what was later depicted in Blade Runner.
Wow.
He said, I can't really even describe it. It's like there are all these Chinese and Japanese signs all over the place, and everything's there's air pollution, and things are kind of misty, and the climate has changed. And, so I think that Courtney Hunt, also he being an amateur screenwriter who would list his stuff with the Writers Guild, may have literally sort of been the originator of the view of Los Angeles in the future that was featured in Blade Runner.
Wow.
Because he did go there. So I met Courtney like around 1970, 71.
Wow. And
then he shows up in my life in summer of 1981 as my second Mars instructor.
Interesting. I had the pleasure of meeting Sid Mead. He was the artist that did all the set designs for Blade Runner. He's a very interesting fellow. Bless you.
Thank you. So what was his name?
Sid Mead. Bless you. Sid Mead. Sid Mead. He's passed away since, but very nice guy and
interesting.
Excellent artist. If you want to look at he starts with scribbles and he makes these futuristic paintings out of them. It's just fantastic.
But, they were going forward in time to get the future of the kids who ran the project, I think, to figure out what happened to them. Mm-hmm. I know that the disease that mimics diabetes that I got was discussed right in front of my father and his friend Connie Chavez and another technician on the project, another mm-hmm. engineer on the project. And my dad actually scouted him for revealing in front of me that I was going to be contracting diabetes.
Wow.
And yet, strangely, my dad never advised me to stay away from high glycemic foods of any kind.
Okay.
That may have had an impact in light of the fact that according to Jack Pruitt, Carl Jack Pruitt, born 1934, who was depicted by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon as being the research director of Project Montauk, is a real guy. I knew him when I was on the project. I met him at the old Sweeney Auditorium in Santa Fe in June of 2003, around June 10th of 2003, with his then still living son, Glenn Pruitt, who I believe was one of the kids on the project with me. Because Jack commented that all of the grown-ups who had been kids on Project Pegasus and been exposed to the Tesla teleporter were developing a disease that mimics diabetes. And he said, you saw the condition that my son Glenn is in. Because Glenn had greeted me at the Sweeney Auditorium when Jack was meeting with me. He set up the meeting.
Okay.
And Jack had left a card in my hotel room, or had one placed in my hotel room in Santa Fe. It's the old Sleep Inn there at I-25 and I-40. It's now like the Inn of New Mexico.
Okay.
Or at least it was recently. And so Jack's statement implies that Glenn was one of the fellow teleportees, and Jack advised me to swing by New Mexico again, and he would try to swing me into these low radiation experiments from a Japanese technology that was being experimented with at LANL, the Los Alamos National Labs, of course, again, who had sent me in time and space. And I ended up not doing so because instead I went up and kickstarted my legal career in Washington at that point in my career.
Okay.
So I ended up not getting that low radiation experiment at LANL, but there's no guarantee it would have worked. But Jack advised me that all of the kids were getting a disease that mimicked diabetes. So that was said right in front of me when I was on the project. But yet I wasn't urged by my father or anybody to avoid high glycemic foods. That's kind of that was a lapse by the Intel people I was working with. There's no reason why that shouldn't have happened.
Right.
You know, certainly by then they knew that high glycemic foods raise our fasting blood glucose and predispose us to diabetes. So I should have not even been eating, you know, a peanut butter payday bar. So my dad knew. In my book about Pegasus, I talk about the 8 things my dad predicted about my future before his death in January of 1990. He talked about the fact that I was going to graduate from law school, because I was still in law school at that point. I was about halfway through law school when my dad passed. He told me I was going to graduate from law school. I was going to pass the Washington State Bar. I was going to take care of my mother for a period of time until her death. He didn't mention 2003, but when I asked for what, his voice kind of shook and he said cancer, which was true. My mom had breast cancer that caused her fatal problems. He said I was going to come back to the house and take care of her for several years when she was sick, which I did. In fact, it was more than a few years. It ended up really occupying much of my 30s, which I did gratefully because I love my mother. She was my best friend and a saint. She was one of the only people I've ever known who really, truly did not have a bad bone in her body. You know, she was really, truly saintly in a unique way.
Sounds like my mom too. Yeah. Wow. That's great.
And so he predicted that. And then he said, you're going to go back to Washington after your mom's death, and start your legal career again in Vancouver, which I did, only because a then sister-in-law of mine picked a granny flat that I rented from somebody to live out of and practice law out of. But my dad mentioned that return to the Northwest, but he made one prediction that has not come true and will not come true. And that is, he said, then you go up to Seattle and your career takes off like a rocket ship. Well, I began to travel up to Seattle to do more eminent cases as a lawyer during my career in Washington, but I never lived there. I think he may have been basing the belief that I was going to move to Seattle on the fact that Alfred Weber and I, since I was living in Vancouver, Washington, right across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon, and Alfred, of course, was and still is living in Vancouver, British Columbia, that my dad thought that when we used a place name of Seattle, Washington on the letters we were putting out about the Mars Anomaly Research Society, that's what my dad was talking about. That's why he said your career takes off like a rocket ship. It was kind of like a space reference.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't want to tell me, and that's when he started talking about serving in the Mars Project, because I was still amnestic about everything about the Mars Project and would not recover my memories until 2009, 19 years after my dad's passing.
Wow.
But they did, I know that they had to have gone forward in time to track the later development of the kids in the program. Because my dad also said, you're going to go to Cambridge. And see, I went to Cambridge after law school.
Okay.
So he mentioned, and you go to Cambridge. And I said, you mean Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard? And he goes, no, Cambridge, England. Wow. So he knew about my attending Cambridge, but that wasn't until 5 years after his death.
Mm-hmm.
So they were using, that's why I like to call it quantum access rather than time travel. Time travel just refers to physical time travel, like the teleporter and the plasma confinement chamber and the Stargate. But quantum access is any technology that allows us to see into the past and future in a non-ordinary way.
Mm-hmm.
And that was basically the thrust of Project Pegasus, was numerous devices that were doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And sending us there to the past and future.
Wow. Well, Andrew,
when we would,
go ahead.
No, when we would be, when we would just go in via chronovisor for 15 minutes, we would then, the scene would just fade and we would pop back into view. There'd be a field of supercharged particles called scintillation. I talked to the technologist John Piers about that in Vancouver, Washington in 2005. He was holding 60 of Ivan Browning's residual patents. And Ivan, of course, was the director of science and technology for CIA from 1959 to 74. And he confirmed that scintillation is just the operation of certain particles under electromagnetic stimulation. So we would be caught in, when we were in for only 15 minutes in the hologram of the chronovisor. And after a certain couple seconds in that hologram, we were there in that time and place. Let's say Ford's Theater on the night that Lincoln was shot. And then the scene would melt and we would be stuck in this field of supercharged particles. It was just like being caught in a room with 1,000 fireflies in it.
Wow.
And we were actually told by Jack Pruitt to sit down and fold our legs and just count back from 100, because before we got to 100, the particles would be gone. Now, when the particles faded, we could see other kids popping into view originally as black body emanations. We would see a head, an arm, etc.
Wow.
And yet, when we were in for more than 15 minutes, a density effect would occur, and they had to put a portal that looked like a soccer goal into the scene. So, for example, when I was brought back from 1905 in the Five Points neighborhood of New York City, where I was stuck for a couple of days and I was just surviving on onion and turnip soup.
Wow.
And I got in trouble for stealing an apple from the refrigerator.
Oh, no.
Or from the ice box, I should say. The program inserted that portal right outside the building, this tenement I was living in. And I've often said if people could see what people were living at in New York City in 1905, they would appreciate the time we're living in, just for modern toilet facilities,
I bet, yeah.
And I would then find myself running through a tunnel. It would get sandier and sandier, and then this portal was attached to the back of a dinosaur tunnel in a New Jersey amusement park. There was a metallic T-Rex-like statue right near the mouth of the tunnel. And we would always tap on that dinosaur statue or metal object, metal statue, to remind ourselves we were back in 1971 or whatever year we had left from.
Wow.
Because we were always afraid of being lost in time.
Sure.
Now, we would then play at a jungle gym and a swing set that were right outside that dinosaur tunnel. It may have been Bertram's Island, which was an amusement park in New Jersey, not far from where I was growing up, that I think today has been shut down, but it was a very famous amusement park. Now, the guy who would pick us up was a guy named Gallagher, and he wore a tam o' shanter. And when I would sit near the front of the van and talk to him about what we were doing, he would go, "Wow, man, that's funky," and to sort of respond to what I was saying, but not doubt it. Mm-hmm. Now, the special educator at the school I was going to was Elaine Gallagher. So to this day, I've never explored this. I think it's possible that the individual who was picking us up in that van when we would be, taken back by a portal from the chronovisor probes and find ourselves running through that New Jersey amusement park till we got to the statue in the front and then basically walked out into the present at the front of that amusement park was the comedian Leo Gallagher. Because he looked like him, he wore a tam o' shanter, and even though he didn't introduce his name to me, his last name,
Yeah.
The teacher was his age and was Elaine. So I think Elaine Gallagher, our special educator, may have been Leo Gallagher's sister. It's just a theory. It could have been somebody else, but boy, it really looked like Leo Gallagher, the comedian.
Interesting.
And he was very, very genial. That's what I remembered. You know, I would tell him the different kinds of time travel we were doing. He would go, really, man? Oh, wow, I can't believe that. That's far out, you know. He was really a funky guy, and I'm pretty sure it could have been Gallagher. So at some point, I'm going to have to go to one of Leo's performances and approach him.
Mm-hmm.
And because I did go to one of his performances. I didn't meet him, but I saw him live. He was hysterical, but I think it may have been. So that's one of the leads. There are a lot of leads like that haven't been chased down.
Mm-hmm. Wow. You know, your story, you've got the most witnesses verifying your story. So, you know, I don't think you should spend any time worrying about people not believing you, because everyone that matters, that knows, believes you. All the other people are shills and, you know, part of the cabal trying to put the kibosh on the truth. You've got a truth movement going. You've been doing it for a number of years, and you are looked up to by everyone in this community. And, you know,
well, thank you, Aaron.
You're welcome.
Well, you know, I like to remind people, and this is why I'm writing about my past lives. Look, I say it in the book. Every life is an experiment. And just as Bucky Fuller said, you know, every day is an experiment. And every day is an experiment. But the truth matters. None of us does everything in one lifetime. Like, I know that at my age, with my visual decline, I will never win an Olympic medal, even if I start practicing as a sharpshooter. I used to have a really good aim with a pistol.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they had me carry the photo flash gun on Mars, because I could protect my colleagues, because I was a really good aim. But I do not plan to compete in the Olympics, and that means I will never compete in the Olympics or win a gold, silver, bronze Olympic medal. Michael Phelps has how many? 30? 40? You know, in other words, in life, just as Desiderata says, there will always be greater and lesser people than ourselves in any indicator. Mm-hmm. There will always be smarter people, better looking people, sexier people, more successful people, richer people, more talented people, whatever. I find it amazing that Bruce Springsteen is now worth $500 million. I saw Bruce in the summer of 1969. He was performing up at a private swim club right up the hill from a pond called Fonus's behind my house. And I was 7 years old in summer of 69. I was walking in a pair of blue jeans and a red shirt with yellow polka dots. And I was barefoot. Mm-hmm. And he stopped his car and looked back. He was all of like 19 years old, right? Because Bruce was born in 49, so he was going on 20. Now, I've never talked about that because, again, I don't want to be viewed as somebody making up stories. Mm-hmm. But when I think about the fact that Bruce has occupied the position of eminence that he does in rock music and folk rock, and folk music for that matter, in politics, literally, so that he's now worth $500 million and he's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I cannot believe that guy I saw riding in his hot rod, who stopped and looked back at me through his rearview mirror, the guy Bruce, who was practicing his very rudimentary, you know, folkabilly rock guitar style up at the swimming pool above the pond where I would go fishing, became Bruce Springsteen, the star. Mm-hmm. That's another lesson in the fact that there's no limit to what any of us can achieve in a particular lifetime. But the bottom line is we all get a couple bites at the apple. As Courtney Hunt once told me, we all come back and we open up like a camera shutter, and then we close, and that's called death. But then we go back to the Godhead, and then we open up again and are born again, and then we close. So everybody has to understand that it serves absolutely no purpose attributing to experience made up stories or science fiction fantasies that confuse the public's understanding of what has actually been done by our great country. I never served in battle. My dad thought I should have. At least should have made myself potentially vulnerable to being killed in battle. Why? Because he and his generation had been killed in great numbers during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
He saw dead children in Italy, France, and Germany. So he thought he could possibly sacrifice his son to the greater good if I was killed in Pegasus. But he wanted me to serve in the military to put myself in danger of losing my life, and as a result thereby saving it as a military man of valor. Well, I became a man of valor, but not a military man of valor, and I would never take that away from the brave American men and women who have been military men and women of valor. Mm-hmm. So what we really have to discourage in this country is thinking that anybody has to usurp somebody else's experience. We cannot experience everything, or even very much, in a particular lifetime. We should exercise all of our genius, all of our goodness. We should spend all our kisses and find the one twin flame that we should be married to, and marry her. Or if you're a woman, marry him. Because life is short, and that's what matters. We should make the use of our talents, like Scripture teaches, and not put our talents underneath a bushel basket. That's what I've tried to do. My goal in life was to be like Benjamin Franklin. And what do you know? I became a lawyer, a writer, a public speaker, a media personality, an inventor, and a presidential candidate after serving as a chrononaut and an astronaut for the country. So there's really no limit. I mean, there's much we can all do. And I like to tell my law clients, we can all do much more than we thought, but we also forget how much it takes to do something of quality, to write a book, to invent something, mm-hmm. to cure a disease. So we should be focusing on important things, and all of us should be scientific and committed to the truth. Mm-hmm. And so I really have to challenge this prevailing belief in the truth movement that everybody has their story. No. People telling the truth have a story. Mm-hmm. What the others are engaging in is an ancient American tradition known as the tall tale. Needless to say, that is not what I've been doing. I'm a student of American history from UCLA. Mm-hmm. I had the privilege of working under Norman Cousins, but look at Norman Cousins' work. He was not writing tall tales. He was writing about the most important issues of our time, like preventing nuclear war. Mm-hmm. Okay? So this is really what we have to talk about, the fact that, look, you can't just blithely continue to interview and entertain the fiction of somebody, like, let's say, Michael McIntosh. Michael has taken my life and for some strange reason applied it to himself. And yet when I would watch Olympic athletes on ABC, during the Olympics, did I believe I was them? Did I believe I had done what they had done? Mm-hmm. Never. Mm-hmm. So we all have to say, okay, this is what I want to do and this is what I want to be. I can't do everything. Right. One of my aunts who was very successful in business even advised me to consider not going to law school because I wanted to be a writer. And I said, no, Aunt Julie, I want to do both. Yeah. And I did. It certainly delayed my book publishing, but I did it. It's what I wanted to do with my life. Well, so this is really where people have to get to. They have to realize that nobody has a franchise on everything. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about non-ordinary experiences that the U.S. government involved in people, it's been a small group of people. I mean, it's been thousands, but it hasn't been everybody speaking out. And I really resent this kind of either embellishment of actual experiencers' stories or just made up science fiction fantasy, because mm-hmm. that's really what has happened. Mm-hmm.
Well, here at the UFO show, we have something going on. It's the UFO hoax video contest, but that's all just in fun because I think we need to have fun in this too. So if you see a future episode where I talk about that, don't think.
In my paranormal trilogy, the second book is dedicated to my contact with the Greys.
Oh, neat. Interesting.
Small Greys throughout my childhood up to age 12, one when I was 18.
Okay.
Two tall Greys that I was introduced to in Pegasus underneath the Manzano weapons storage area near Albuquerque. Okay. And even an orange that appeared next to my bed. Now, why was that happening? We have to ask just how smart the ETs are. Because my dad was contacted by a colonel for the Air Force in 1952, in October of 52, and ordered to report to Curtis Wright to work on the metal alloy by which the ramjet would be built to chase the ET craft out of our atmosphere and away from the near-Earth environment. So I was an experiencer of ET contact as the youngest son of one of the American aeronautical engineers who was literally chasing them away from our planet.
Wow.
So that's where we have to start to ask our questions. Is it true what Courtney Hunt told me, that the children of the astronauts, the children of aerospace engineers like my dad, were all being visited? I mean, there's dimensionalities to the ET contact experience that we haven't even explored.
Right.
That's what we have to do, is focus on the truth. And I believe it's the right of anybody who's actually served the government to analyze the claims of a false claimant and say, no, you can't, claim, as Randy Kramer does, that that his wife's name was Deirdre, and then a couple of years later state that her name was Doris, when she was his wife and they lived on another planet together after marriage, and she died in his arms. That's just not credible. Now, I know Corey Good has been attacked a lot. I don't really have a concrete position on Corey. I certainly think he might have been an experiencer. I think the telling of his work might have been embellished in his handling by David Wilcock. But I know that Corey has been so adamant about suing those who have denied the truth of his experiences that he may very well be a real experiencer.
Yeah.
When he stated that he had met his handler on the Kuiper Belt, or that after Buzz Aldrin, John Kerry, and Al Gore went to Antarctica to see the ruins under the ice, a UFO showed up behind his house to take him there, I was a little bit skeptical about Corey's claims, but I still haven't dismissed them because I feel that his overall, this is one of the problems in the truth movement is, his statement about the blue avians, and people were saying, he just took that from that Russian book where ET species were depicted in illustrations. Well, yes and no. I mean, it could either be corroboration of what was in that book,
right,
or it could be copycatism. We don't know. Same thing with Travis Walton's case. I mean, look, 6 colleagues saw Travis Walton being abducted.
Right.
It's hard to deny that.
Right.
I've met Travis. I've spoken with him. I believe he's a man of truth and quite a sincere, humble man. So whoever they were, picked the right man to tell the story. So I think we have to be discerning about what people are saying. But we really have to say, okay, is this corroboration or is this copycatism? What could be going on here? And I do think that we should use this doctrine that I've articulated, known the doctrine of objectified open-mindedness. Because at the end of the day, none of us has experienced somebody else's experiences. So it may be that some people's experiences haven't occurred to them, but have been simulations that have somehow been put in their mind by a higher intelligence to somehow cause the evolution of our species on Earth. That's possible. I don't know, but I do know when I've caught some people just making up stories that are not credible at this point. I have to speak out. Well, I've mentioned 2 in this meeting, in this discussion.
Someday, we are going to, thanks to you, going to have access in some form of the chronovisor, and we can get to the bottom of who's telling the truth and who isn't, once and for all. But for right now, Andrew, we've been talking for quite a while. I think maybe we should pick up again on another episode. I want to thank you so much for coming on. I've really wanted to talk to you for so many years, and I know my listeners are going to really enjoy this. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you for having me on, Aaron, and I look forward to future discussions with you.
Thank you. Take care. Peace in.